Welcome to Terrified Tales, where things are about to get unsettling. Before we dive deeper into the darkness, make sure to like and subscribe. Let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. Are you brave enough to be here at night? Now, relax and let the fear take hold. Story 1. The night was a quiet one, as most were at the Dunridge Hotel, an aging place of fading grandeur, nestled in a forgotten part of the city, where the air seemed too still and time hung in corners like cobwebs. The kind of place that had long since slipped from travel guides, sustained only by business trips, budget tourists, and the few who preferred to be unnoticed. Rebecca sat behind the front desk, her second week into the night shift. She didn't mind the isolation. Truth be told, she welcomed it. After what had happened with her sister, well, silence was easier than the questions people asked when they cared, or worse, when they didn't. The desk lamp flickered now and then, as though tired of its duty. The pale glow from the lobby chandelier made the velvet wallpaper appear bruised, and the faint scent of mildew clung to the floorboards beneath her feet. The ticking of the antique lobby clock was the loudest sound in the room, until the door creaked open. Rebecca looked up. A woman stood in the entrance, half illuminated by the soft halo of the streetlight behind her. The automatic doors hadn't opened. She must have used the side door, the one reserved for emergencies. A strange detail, but Rebecca's eyes were already drawn to the dress, a rich, gleaming red like silk soaked in wine. Her skin was pale, like porcelain chilled under moonlight. Her dark eyes shimmered, not with light, but with some deeper hue, as if reflecting a place Rebecca couldn't see. No coat, no bag, no shoes, just the dress. She stepped forward. Her heels, barely visible beneath the long hem, made no sound on the old tile. "Good evening," Rebecca said, forcing a smile. That felt more like a grimace. "Welcome to the Dunridge." The woman did not speak. She tilted her head, studying Rebecca with an intensity that pressed against her skin like cold breath. Rebecca glanced at the old computer. "Do you have a reservation?" Still no answer. Just a slow, deliberate blink. Rebecca's fingers hovered over the keyboard. She couldn't explain it, but the moment felt suspended, as if time had paused to let this woman enter unannounced. Her instinct screamed to ask again, or to call security, or even to run. But instead, her hand moved to the key rack behind her. She pulled down the brass key labeled 306, its tag dulled with age. The room had been listed as out of service for years, maintenance issues supposedly. But tonight, the room number came to her fingers as naturally as if she'd been trained to hand it over. The woman's lips curled just a little into what might have been a smile or a smirk. It vanished before Rebecca could decide. She took the key without touching. Rebecca's hand, her fingers hovered just above, and yet the metal warmed in Rebecca's palm as if touched by fire. As the woman turned toward the elevator, Rebecca's voice broke the silence. "Ma'am, I didn't get your name." The woman paused mid-stride, her back still to Rebecca. Then, in a voice that was barely audible, she said, "Evelyn," and stepped into the elevator, vanishing behind the tarnished doors with a whisper of static. Rebecca sat still for a long moment, her heartbeat ticking louder than the clock behind her. She didn't know why her hand trembled, or why the key rack seemed one hook emptier than it should have been. She only knew one thing for certain. She hadn't asked for Evelyn's ID. She hadn't checked her in, and the computer still showed room 306 as unoccupied. The phone rang at precisely 2:06 a.m. The exact minute the clock above the fireplace clicked forward with a hollow thunk. Rebecca, jolted from her half-sleep, snatched the receiver before the second ring. "Front desk," she said, rubbing her temple. A man's voice came through, nervous, dry. "Sorry, Yeah, I'm in 308. I think someone's crying next door. It's been going on for like 20 minutes. Can you check it out? Rebecca's breath caught. Sure, she said. I'll send someone right away. She hung up without waiting for the caller to thank her. The front desk light flickered again, a little longer this time, and when it steadied, Rebecca's own reflection in the polished surface looked like it was watching her. Waiting, she reached for the hotel's walkie-talkie. Dan, you there? She asked, her voice quieter than usual. A static burst, then the familiar gruffness of Daniel, the overnight security guard. Yep, still awake. What's up? Can you check room 306? A pause. Then, 306. I thought that one was... I know, she cut in. Just check it. He didn't ask again. On my way. 10 minutes passed. Rebecca watched the hallway feed on the security monitor, its grainy, green-tinged footage barely showing the elevators. The feed for the third floor glitched, fuzzing in and out like an old VHS. Dan? She radioed. No answer. She tried again. Dan, do you copy? Silence. Her fingers tapped against the counter. Then the elevator doors opened on the screen. Daniel stepped out. He looked toward room 306 and paused. He knocked, waited. He reached for his keyring, hesitated, then unlocked the door, pushed it open, disappeared inside. The hallway feed went black. Rebecca stared, breath held. The phone rang again. She grabbed it too fast. Front desk. No one answered, but she could hear something. Soft, rhythmic, like someone breathing, close to the speaker. Then the whisper, "Come see." The line went dead. Rebecca's shoes echoed as she walked down the hallway of the third floor. She shouldn't have come up. She knew that. Protocol was to stay at the desk, to wait for security. But something in that voice had pulled her. The hallway smelled like damp wood and old perfume, and the overhead lights buzzed faintly. Room 306's door stood ajar. Inside, it was dim. Dust hung suspended in the air like falling ash. The bed was perfectly made. No sign of Evelyn, no sign of Daniel. Her eyes scanned the room, breath tight in her chest. Then she noticed something. The mirror on the far wall, ornate, cracked at the edges, reflected more than it should. Rebecca turned toward it. The room behind her was empty, but in the mirror, Evelyn stood by the bed, her head bowed, her hands cradling something invisible. Her face was wet with tears that never fell. Rebecca spun around. No one. Just silence, and the faintest echo of a sob that didn't belong to her. She backed out of the room, heart hammering, and slammed the door shut. Only then did she see it. The key for room 306 was back in her hand, cold as ice and dripping wet. The chill in Rebecca's fingers was the first thing she noticed. The key to room 306, now drenched in something cold and wet. Her breath hitched in her throat as she stared down at the metal. There was no mistaking it. The key had been soaked, though the air around her was dry. As if something had reached out from the room and left its mark on her. Something invisible and unshakable. Her gaze darted back to the hallway where the faint echo of sobbing still seemed to hang in the air. She blinked, trying to clear the image of Evelyn's pale, tear-streaked face from her mind, but it clung there, like a shadow too persistent to shake off. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. Rebecca's heart pounded in her chest as she glanced at the other rooms along the hallway, all silent, empty. But room 306, it loomed at the end of the hall, a malignant presence she couldn't escape. With shaking hands, she shoved the key into her pocket and turned to leave. The elevator pinged behind her, its door sliding open with a quiet whoosh. A figure stepped out, silhouetted in the dim light. Rebecca. The voice, deep and familiar, belonged to Daniel. His uniform was wrinkled, his face pale, His usual confidence was gone, replaced by a hollow expression, eyes wide and darting nervously to the room behind her. "You," he started, but his words trailed off, as if he had just realized something too late. Something horrible. Rebecca spun around, locking eyes with him. "Where were you? I couldn't get a hold of you on the radio." Daniel swallowed hard, then looked down at the floor, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He paused, his voice barely audible. "I went in. I didn't find anyone. No one was there. But the whole place felt wrong. I didn't see her, but I heard something, Rebecca. Something was watching me." A ripple of cold passed over Rebecca. "What do you mean, watching you?" His eyes flickered to the door of 306. "I don't know. I heard it. Someone was breathing, but it wasn't like a normal breath. It was slow, drawn out. I thought it was a joke at first. But then I saw her reflection in the mirror." Rebecca's breath caught in her throat. "Her reflection?" Daniel's lips trembled. "I'm not crazy, Rebecca. I swear to God I saw her standing by the bed, staring right at me in the mirror. But when I turned around, nothing, just the room. And then the crying started again, not like before. It was deeper, more desperate, almost like someone was trying to scream but they couldn't." His voice faltered, and for a moment, the air between them seemed to grow thick, oppressive. The elevator doors shut behind him with a soft thud, and Rebecca shivered, the sound of metal closing behind him too final, too isolating. "I don't care what you say," Daniel continued, his voice low, almost afraid. "That room's cursed. No one should ever stay in there." Rebecca could feel the weight of his words settling into her chest, like a stone sinking into water. She nodded, her throat tight. "I know." But then something in her flickered. She didn't know why, but the pull toward that room, the sense that something unfinished, something unspoken lingered there, was unbearable. She had to know more. She had to. "Maybe we should tell the manager," Daniel suggested, looking over his shoulder toward the stairwell, as though half expecting something to lunge out from the shadows. This isn't normal, Rebecca." Rebecca glanced at the elevator once more. No, she couldn't wait for the manager. If Evelyn had died here, if she was really haunting this place, if something had followed her out of that room, then there was only one thing left to do. "I'm going back in," she whispered. The words surprised her even as they left her lips. She didn't know why, but the thought of leaving the mystery unresolved, leaving Evelyn's presence lingering, like smoke in the hall, was unbearable. Daniel's face twisted with concern. "No, don't, Rebecca, you can't. It's too dangerous." But she was already moving. She didn't hear his protest as she turned and walked down the hallway, her footsteps now echoing louder than they should. Each step felt heavier, each breath more difficult to take. The hallway stretched in front of her, longer now, as though the walls themselves were inching closer with every step. She reached the door to room 306 and stared at the brass handle, the polished wood, the way the door seemed to stand out from the others, as if it were waiting for her. A shiver ran down her spine as she raised her hand to knock. But before her knuckles could meet the door, it opened on its own, as if the room had been expecting her. The hinges creaked softly, the smell of stale air and something far more unsettling wafting out from within. She stepped inside, the door clicking shut behind her with an eerie finality. The room was exactly as it had been before, perfectly neat, almost sterile in its immaculate order. But now there was something different. A strange, tangible heaviness hung in the air. It wasn't just the usual scent of dust and old wallpaper. There was something more, something deeper, darker. Rebecca's gaze was drawn to the mirror across the room. She approached it slowly, her pulse quickening. Her reflection flickered in the glass. No, it wasn't just her reflection. It was Evelyn, Her face was different this time, as though her ghost had grown clearer, more present. Her features, once indistinct, were sharp, her dark eyes hollow and filled with a profound sadness that tugged at Rebecca's soul. The mirror seemed to pulse with an unnatural light, a dim, faint glow emanating from its surface, as if something were pushing against it from the other side. Evelyn's form was no longer just an image. She stood, or rather, hovered, her face tilted, her mouth moving silently. Rebecca couldn't hear the words, but her lips shaped something desperate, something pleading. Suddenly, the mirror cracked down the center, a jagged line splitting the glass. A chill ran through Rebecca, her breath hitching in her chest. The crack seemed to widen, and the room grew darker, colder, until she could see her own breath in front of her. And then, a voice, soft at first, almost a whisper, rippled through the air. "Help me." Rebecca froze. She knew the voice. It was Evelyn's. But it wasn't just her voice. It was something else, something older, something beyond. "Please, help me." The plea was more than just words. It wrapped around her like a noose, pulling her deeper into the room. She reached out, her fingers trembling, almost instinctively toward the mirror. But as soon as her skin brushed against the surface, the world tilted, the floor beneath her feet seemingly vanishing. Her pulse quickened, her breath short as the room spun. She pulled her hand back in shock, but it was too late. The mirror's surface began to ripple, like water disturbed by something beneath it. The reflections distorted, stretching unnaturally as the air grew thick with a suffocating weight. And then, in the reflection, something shifted. A figure, tall and indistinct, lurked in the darkened edges of the glass, its features blurred, but the presence undeniable. Rebecca's heart raced. The shadows seemed to close in on her, and the whispers grew louder. Now a chorus of voices, all pleading, all desperate. She couldn't breathe, couldn't move, and then the door behind her slammed open, and everything stopped. The door slammed open, the sharp bang of it reverberating through Rebecca's chest. Her breath caught in her throat as she whirled around, heart pounding, eyes frantic. It was Daniel. His face was pale, his expression taut with urgency. His eyes flicked nervously to the mirror and then back to Rebecca, his voice strained. "Rebecca, we need to leave now." The urgency in his tone was unlike anything she'd heard before, and for a brief, terrifying moment, she wondered if he was referring to something more than just her being in the room. But she didn't have time to ask. She could feel it. The room, the mirror, the presence of something inescapable that pulled at her very soul. It was like the walls were pressing in on her, the air becoming thicker with each passing second. The sobs started again, low, mournful, a deep, gut-wrenching sound that seemed to come from everywhere. It was as though the very room was crying, the old floorboards beneath their feet groaning in protest. And then, from the corner of her eye, she saw something, a shadow, or perhaps a figure, shifting against the far wall. Something that was not a reflection, but a presence. Her heartbeat thudded in her chest. She wanted to scream, to ask Daniel what was happening, but her throat felt too tight, her voice lost in the oppressive weight that had settled over them. She couldn't move. "Rebecca, now." Daniel's voice was more desperate, his hand reaching for her arm. She felt the coldness of his touch, but it didn't offer comfort. In fact, it made the air around them grow colder still. But as his fingers brushed against her sleeve, the sobbing intensified, and the air seemed to freeze. "Help me." The voice came again, clear this time, and filled the room, bouncing off the walls and closing in around her. Rebecca's chest tightened. The voice, though soft, was unmistakably Evelyn's, but it wasn't just pleading anymore. There was something raw, something desperate and angry in it now. The words morphed into something harder, jagged. "Leave, or I will take you too." Rebecca recoiled, her eyes widening in disbelief. She could feel the temperature drop even further, a biting cold that dug into her bones, and yet the sweat on her brow made her skin feel clammy. Daniel was tugging at her arm now, pulling her toward the door, but before she could take a step, the door slammed shut. The sound was deafening, the hinges creaking violently as though they were being twisted by unseen hands. Her pulse raced as she whipped around, staring in horror at the door now locked, tight, the handle rattling with an unnerving, unnatural force. The shadows in the corners of the room deepened, pressing in on them, closing them off from the outside world. It felt like the very walls were shifting, distorting, breathing. The sobbing became louder, more intense. And then the mirrors, all of them, shattered. Rebecca stumbled back, her hands flying to her face, instinctively shielding her eyes from the sound of cracking glass. But the mirror in front of her, the one she'd been staring at so intently, the one where Evelyn's ghost had appeared, did not just shatter in a violent burst. It splintered slowly, like ice breaking, each crack forming a jagged web that stretched and pulled apart with a sound that made her stomach churn. And within the cracks, a figure moved. Rebecca's throat tightened and her legs threatened to buckle beneath her. She knew that it wasn't just the glass shattering. It was the mirror itself pulling something through. Someone. Her pulse drummed in her ears as she forced herself to step forward, drawn toward the mirror despite the overwhelming sensation to run. The figure was rising from the shattered glass, its shape becoming clearer. Evelyn's face, now no longer just a reflection, emerged from the mirror, her eyes hollow, dark as night. Her mouth opened, but no sound came. Only the soft, distorted sobbing continued to echo in the room. "Please, you have to understand." The voice was distorted now, as if coming from miles away, echoing in Rebecca's mind. Her legs trembled. She couldn't look away, even as the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to grow thicker, wrapping themselves around her. The ghostly woman in red stepped out of the mirror with a slow, deliberate grace, her feet not touching the ground. She glided, her figure drifting toward them like a mist. Daniel backed away, his eyes wide with terror, but Rebecca stood frozen. She felt herself being pulled in, as if Evelyn's presence was latching onto her very soul, drawing her closer. She wanted to turn, to run, but she couldn't move. She felt the cold fingers of the past wrap around her chest, squeezing the air from her lungs. The ghost in front of her wasn't just haunting this room, it was haunting her. "Please, help me." Evelyn's voice came again, quieter now, and this time Rebecca felt it, like a wound opening in her chest. "She can't leave. She won't leave." The words sent a ripple of horror through her. Evelyn's form wavered, flickering, like a candle about to go out. It was as though the very air around them was splitting in two, tearing apart at the seams. The more Rebecca stared, the more she felt herself falling into Evelyn's world, the ghost's sorrowful, tormented, trapped existence. But suddenly Evelyn stopped. Her hollow eyes locked onto Rebecca's with an unsettling clarity. Her voice, low and chilling, rang in her mind. "You're the one. You're the one who can set me free." Rebecca's mind swirled with confusion. The words were clear, but the meaning was buried beneath layers of fear and dread. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. And that was when she realized Evelyn's form wasn't just a ghost. It wasn't just a spirit trapped between worlds. Evelyn was the room. She was the dark soul of it, feeding on the pain, the grief, the brokenness, the loneliness that lingered in the corners of that room. Evelyn's anguish, her unfinished business, had woven itself into the very fabric of the hotel, trapping everyone who entered within her despair. Rebecca felt her heart thud painfully against her chest. You're asking me for help," she whispered hoarsely, but she couldn't understand the question forming in her mind. What could she do? She barely knew the story. How could she fix this? "Please," Evelyn repeated, now closer. Her breath, like ice, brushed against Rebecca's. "Face, help me!" Suddenly, Rebecca's legs gave out beneath her, and she collapsed to the floor. She could feel the presence around her tightening, closing in on her. It was too much. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't move. Daniel was shouting something. She could barely hear him over the deafening thrum of her heartbeat, the desperate wailing that seemed to come from everywhere. His hand reached out, but as he grabbed her wrist, a violent surge of energy jolted through her. It sent her spiraling back into the broken glass, the jagged shards cutting into her skin like invisible claws. For a moment, everything went black. But as Rebecca fell into unconsciousness, one thought haunted her mind. What did Evelyn mean by "help me"? When Rebecca came to, the first thing she noticed was the weight on her chest. It wasn't a physical burden, but an oppressive, invisible force that pressed down, making it hard to breathe. Her throat felt raw, as if she had screamed until her lungs burned, yet no sound had escaped. The world around her was hazy, blurred by the jagged edge of reality she could barely grasp. The air smelled stale, old and musty. It clung to her like a suffocating blanket. She tried to sit up, but her limbs felt heavy, as if they had been bound by invisible ropes. Every inch of her body felt tired, drained, as though someone had been leeching away her energy. Low, muffled sound reached her ears, something indistinct at first, like the hum of a far-off machine, but then it became clearer. Crying. Soft, sorrowful crying, as if someone were weeping just behind her, breathless and broken. Her eyes fluttered open, and she immediately regretted it. The walls around her seemed to warp, shifting with a subtle, unnatural fluidity. The wallpaper, once a muted shade of cream, was now cracked, peeling, the edges curling like decaying paper. The shadows in the corners seemed to stretch farther than they should have, draping the room in an eerie twilight that made her head swim. Rebecca's breath caught in her throat as she turned her head, the sound of crying growing louder. There was no one in the room with her, no figure, no ghost, but the walls. They felt like they were closing in. "Daniel," she croaked, her voice a dry whisper. The words seemed to hang in the air, absorbed by the oppressive silence. No response. She tried to move, to push herself upright, but something was wrong. The room was too still. The very air around her seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, the faint vibrations almost imperceptible. She could hear the murmur of voices, voices that were not her own, soft and fragmented, like a conversation held underwater. She couldn't make out the words, but she could feel them. The weight of unspoken things pressed down on her, there, urgency building with each passing second. Suddenly she was standing. Rebecca hadn't realized she had risen from the bed, hadn't felt her legs move. But there she was, her feet planted firmly on the cold, hardwood floor. Her head spun as she stumbled forward, her hand brushing against the wall to steady herself. The cry reached her ears again, clearer this time, louder, filling the air with its raw emotion. The sound was coming from behind her, from the mirror. It was no longer the cracked glass she had seen before, the one that had shattered into 1,000 pieces. The mirror was whole again, its surface gleaming with a smoothness that shouldn't have been possible. And standing in front of it was Evelyn. Her figure was distorted, her features blurred and shifting, as if she were made of smoke, flickering, unstable, like a flame in a breeze. She was there, and then she was not. Her form twisted and reformed, an echo of herself, lost between the tangible and the intangible. The glowing red of her dress seemed to flicker in and out, as though the very color was too vibrant for the world she inhabited. "Help me." The voice, once pleading, now carried an edge of desperation, of hunger. Rebecca's heart thundered in her chest as she stepped forward, instinctively drawn to the figure in the mirror. She reached out a trembling hand, her fingers brushing against the cool glass. At her touch, the mirror rippled. For a moment, it felt as if the world around her tilted, everything spinning in a vertigo of shifting realities. Her reflection wavered, distorting like liquid. And then, she was there. She blinked. Rebecca's breath caught in her throat as she realized with growing horror that she was no longer standing in the room. She was now inside the mirror. Her feet were on the cold floor of an unfamiliar place, and the walls around her were not the ones she had left behind. She was trapped. The room before her had changed. It was darker, the air thick with dampness. The walls were lined with decay, dripping with what looked like black mildew, as though the very structure of the place was rotting from within. The floor was slick, covered in a layer of wet grime. And there, at the far end of the room, was the bed. Rebecca's heart skipped a beat. It was the same bed, the one from room 306. But it looked different now, older, worn. The sheets were tangled, darkened with age and neglect. And lying on the bed was the body of a woman, Evelyn. Her once glorious red dress was now stained and tattered, hanging loosely on her skeletal frame. Her eyes were wide open, staring at nothing, vacant and unseeing. Her hands were outstretched, fingers curled in a desperate silent plea. Rebecca's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to scream, but no sound came. She wanted to run, to escape, but her feet were rooted to the spot. Something held her there, something unseen, something that wasn't just the ghost of Evelyn, but the presence of her. The room grew colder still. The air became thick, almost suffocating, as though the very space around her was alive, pressing in from all sides. The whispering voices returned, louder now. A chorus of mournful pleas, of anguish and rage, all tangled together in a symphony of suffering. "Leave, before it's too late." The voice of Evelyn rasped, her mouth moving without sound, as though her very being was trapped in the space between life and death. And then, in the flickering light of the distorted world around her, Evelyn's form began to shift. Her skeletal body twisted, convulsing as though she was struggling to break free from something, from herself. Her skin stretched and warped, contorting like wax under a flame. And for a brief moment, Rebecca saw what lay beneath. Bones. Not just the bones of a body, but something more. Something wrong. Something ancient and malicious that had twisted and rotted within the woman for years. The walls around her began to move. Rebecca gasped, stepping back, but the room seemed to grow smaller, the walls narrowing inward, as if the very space she inhabited was alive and closing in on her. The temperature dropped, and she could see her breath in the air swirling in icy tendrils. Evelyn's face twisted into something darker, her lips curling into a jagged, horrifying smile. But it wasn't a smile of joy, it was something worse. It was the smile of something that had been waiting, something patient and hungry. "I will take you, just as I took him." The voice echoed in her mind, the words like a sharp needle digging into her thoughts. Her vision blurred, her knees buckled beneath her, and she felt a tug at her chest, as though something were pulling at her very soul. She fought it, clawing at her throat, gasping for air as she stumbled back, trying to break free. But the world around her continued to shift, the walls squeezing tighter, the shadows closing in, and Evelyn's figure growing ever more distorted, ever more inhuman. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, the room shattered. Everything went black. Rebecca awoke with a sharp, ragged breath, as if breaking the surface of a dark ocean. Her limbs felt heavy, and the air was thick with the scent of mildew. She gasped, heart pounding, eyes wide as she looked around. She was back in room 306, but it wasn't the same. The room was dark now, the shadows so thick that they felt almost tangible. The bed was empty, but the faint scent of decay lingered in the air. The walls, once pristine, were now streaked with dark stains, the air cold and damp. And standing in the doorway, just beyond the edge of the dim light, was Evelyn. Her red dress was tattered and torn, her eyes hollow. But it was the smile that chilled Rebecca to her core. It wasn't a smile of sorrow anymore. It was a smile of victory. "You can't leave," Evelyn's voice rasped, low and guttural. "Not now. Not after everything you've seen." Rebecca's body trembled as she stepped backward, but her feet were rooted to the ground. The walls were closing in again, and then Evelyn's voice whispered, more chilling than ever, "You are part of this now." Rebecca's heartbeat thundered in her ears, drowning out the cold whispers that seemed to echo in the very marrow of her bones. The room was darker now, the shadows thicker, as if the very fabric of the world had become suffused with an overwhelming sense of dread. Evelyn stood before her, her form flickering like a dying candle, a cruel grin stretching across her hollow face. There was something terribly final in her expression, as if she had been waiting for this moment. Waiting for Rebecca to come to her, to step into her trap. Rebecca's chest tightened, the air thickening with every breath. She wanted to scream, to run, but her feet felt like they were glued to the floor. The room felt alive, its walls, the furniture, even the light itself, all seemed to pulse with a sickly rhythm, pulling her deeper into the suffocating atmosphere. The scent of decay, of rot, filled her nostrils. But it was no longer just the smell of the room. It was the smell of something that had lived too long in the dark, something ancient that fed on suffering. "You're a part of this now." Evelyn's voice was soft, but it carried an undercurrent of something far more sinister. Her eyes gleamed with malice, her lips curling into a smile that was as much a snarl as it was a grin. "You've seen too much. You've felt the pull. You're trapped here, Rebecca, just like I was." The words echoed in her mind like a death knell, each one driving her further into despair. Rebecca opened her mouth to speak, to ask why, to demand answers, but the words were lost in her throat. There was something in the air, something intangible, that made it impossible to form a coherent thought. Evelyn stepped forward, gliding across the room with a smooth, unnatural grace. Her dress, once vibrant red, was now ragged, stained with something darker than mere fabric. It clung to her gaunt form, twisting with each movement like the very embodiment of the torment she had endured. "You don't understand, do you?" Evelyn continued, her voice softening, almost a whisper, as she circled Rebecca like a predator toying with its prey. "You think you can help me. You think you can free me. But you are mistaken. This is who I am now. This room, this place, it's me. It's my prison, and it's yours now too." Rebecca's breath hitched. She wanted to recoil, to run, but the weight of Evelyn's words, her presence, was too heavy. There was something real here now, something that couldn't be shaken off with a simple escape. Her gaze flicked to the mirror once again, but it wasn't the mirror she had seen before. The reflection was different. The glass was shattered, jagged pieces gleaming like knives, but the image of Evelyn was no longer a reflection. Evelyn was standing there, her form filling the space beyond the glass, her eyes staring out at Rebecca. The glass seemed to pull at her like an invisible hand reaching from the depths. She could feel it, a pull, as if the mirror had become a doorway and Evelyn was trying to drag her through. "You think you're not bound to this place, don't you?" Evelyn's voice rose, sharp and bitter, filled with an edge that made the hairs on the back of Rebecca's neck stand on end. "But I've been waiting for someone like you." Rebecca's mind raced. She could feel it now. She could feel the room closing in, the walls pushing against her, the mirror pulling at her very soul. She was suffocating, drowning in the weight of it all. The sorrow, the anger, the endless, bitter grief that had filled this room for so long, it was now hers too. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling, her heart thudding painfully in her chest. "I don't want this. I don't want to be part of this curse." Evelyn's laugh echoed through the room, soft and unsettling. It wasn't the laugh of a person. It was the laugh of something much older, much darker, something that had long ago shed its humanity. "You don't have a choice, Rebecca." Evelyn's words were final. "You think you can escape. You think you can leave. The curse binds us all. The pain, the suffering. It's in the very walls of this hotel, and now it's in you. You'll never be free." The room began to darken. Further, the shadows pooling together, converging on Rebecca. She could feel it now. The pull of the curse, the weight of it, settling into her bones, wrapping around her heart. The walls were no longer just walls. They were alive, twisting and shifting, pressing inward, as if the room itself was tightening its grip around her. Her breathing grew shallow as the world around her seemed to close in, suffocating her in its icy embrace. Every heartbeat was like a drumbeat, echoing in the suffocating dark. The shadows felt real, tangible, pressing against her skin, crawling beneath her clothes, crawling beneath her soul. Evelyn's form drifted closer, her ghostly presence sending a chill through Rebecca's body. Her eyes, once hollow and empty, now gleamed with something else, something dangerous, something hungry. "It's too late to run," Evelyn whispered, her voice a rasping hiss that sent a wave of dread down Rebecca's spine. "You are mine now, and you will never leave." Rebecca's pulse thundered in her ears. She had to fight. She had to do something. She couldn't stay here. She couldn't let Evelyn's curse drag her down into the abyss. Her eyes darted around the room. There had to be a way out. She couldn't let herself become another soul trapped in this hotel, another piece of the endless torment that had claimed so many before her. Her gaze landed on the door. It was cracked open. The room had shifted, but the door was real. Rebecca forced her legs to move, one step, then another, her breath ragged as she fought against the oppressive weight of the room. She felt the curse tightening around her chest, but she pushed through it, her hand shaking as she reached for the door. Before she could touch the handle, a violent snap of energy coursed through the air, and the door slammed shut with such force that the entire room shook. Rebecca staggered back, her heart racing in her chest. The walls were moving again, the mirror gleaming like a portal to another world, and Evelyn was everywhere. "You can't escape," Evelyn's voice crooned from all directions now. "This is where you belong." The shadows grew deeper, the darkness pressing in from every angle, and for the first time Rebecca understood the terrifying truth. The curse had been waiting for her. It had been drawing her in, feeding on her every step, and now she was part of it. Rebecca's mind swirled with panic. She had to find a way to stop it. She couldn't just let it consume her. But as she looked around the room, she realized there was no escape. There was no way out. And then, in a split second of clarity, the horrifying realization struck her. The mirror wasn't just a reflection. It wasn't just Evelyn. The mirror was the gateway, a gateway to something darker, a gateway that would consume her. And in that moment, Rebecca knew one terrible, undeniable truth. The curse of room 306 was not just a haunting, it was a trap, and it was waiting for her to step inside. The room around Rebecca felt like it was pressing in on her from every direction. The air had turned stagnant, thick with something ancient, an oppressive weight that clung to her skin like the breath of something not quite human. The mirror glowed faintly, its glass now a distorted, rippling surface, as though it were no longer a reflection, but a living entity itself, pulsing with malevolent energy. Evelyn's presence was everywhere. In the corners of the room, in the shifting shadows that seemed to move with a will of their own, in the cold, suffocating air. Her voice echoed, a soft, rhythmic chant, growing louder with every passing second. You cannot escape. You will never leave this place. This is your home now, your prison. Rebecca's body trembled. The weight of the curse, the sheer malevolence of Evelyn's words, threatening to crush her. She could feel the darkness closing in around her, the shadows, writhing like hungry serpents, seeking to drag her deeper into the void. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. The only thing she knew for certain was that if she didn't act now, she would be swallowed whole, just like all the others who had come before her. Her heart pounded in her chest, the rhythm echoing through her bones, urging her to run, to fight, to do anything but stand here and wait for the inevitable. She had to fight. She had to break free. Evelyn's form loomed larger now, her face a twisted mask of sorrow and rage, her hollow eyes locked onto Rebecca's with a hunger that seemed to reach straight into her soul. She drifted closer, the edges of her figure flickering like a dying flame. You are mine, Evelyn whispered, her voice a caress that sent a shiver through Rebecca's spine. You can't fight me. I've been waiting for you. A surge of energy, dark and suffocating, rushed through the room as though the very walls of room 306 were alive, wrapping themselves around Rebecca like chains. She felt herself being pulled toward the mirror, the edges of her vision blurring as she stumbled forward, her body betraying her, as though it were being dragged by some unseen force. The air turned freezing, the temperature plummeting so quickly that Rebecca's breath became visible in front of her, swirling in the stillness like smoke. The room was shifting, stretching, warping into something that wasn't real, something otherworldly. She could feel the fabric of reality tearing, like a paper unraveling at the seams, and in that moment she understood. This room, this cursed place, was a tear in the very fabric of existence itself. It was a doorway, a gateway that would consume her. Help me, Rebecca. Evelyn's voice came again, soft but insistent, like a soft wind brushing against her ear. You have the power to set me free. You have the power to end this. Words echoed through her mind, and for a split second Rebecca hesitated. She saw it, the image of Evelyn trapped in the mirror, her face twisted with sorrow, her eyes pleading. Help me. It was the same message she had heard from the very beginning, the same words that had drawn her into this nightmare. But then Rebecca understood. It wasn't Evelyn asking for help. It was the curse, the malevolent force that had bound her to this room, to this mirror, to this hotel. Evelyn was the vessel for something darker, something far older, something that thrived on pain, suffering, and the souls of those who entered. Rebecca's breath came in shallow gasps. She had thought that Evelyn's plea was a cry for salvation, a plea for mercy. But it was never about mercy. Evelyn wasn't asking to be freed. She was asking for another soul to take her place. No, Rebecca whispered, her voice barely audible, but it was enough. I won't become you. I won't join you. As the words left her lips, the room seemed to respond, the walls groaning, the floor trembling beneath her feet. The shadows deepened, twisting around her like snakes. Evelyn's form flickered in and out of existence, her smile turning darker, more sinister, her hollow eyes narrowing into slits.
"You are already mine," Evelyn's voice hissed, now laced with fury. "There is no escape. You are bound to me. You will never leave. You are already part of this place." Rebecca's pulse hammered in her chest as she felt the invisible chains of the curse tighten around her. But she wouldn't let it happen. She wouldn't let the curse claim her. She forced her feet to move, stumbling backward as she pushed through the weight that pressed down on her. Her hands trembled, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. She reached for the broken mirror, the jagged shards of glass now glowing, faintly, pulsing with an unnatural light. The mirror, the gateway, was her only hope. She had to destroy it, destroy the curse. With trembling hands, Rebecca grabbed a shard of glass from the floor, its edge sharp enough to draw blood. She lifted it high, her breath ragged, her mind focused on the task ahead, and then, with a cry that echoed through the room, she drove the shard into the mirror. The glass shattered with an ear-splitting crack that made Rebecca's teeth rattle in her skull. The walls of the room shook violently, as though the very foundation of the hotel were crumbling beneath her feet. The shadows recoiled, and Evelyn let out a shriek, a terrible, soul-wrenching sound that made the air feel thick. With agony, Rebecca fell to her knees as the ground beneath her buckled. She could feel the curse fighting back, the walls pressing in, the mirror's reflection pulling at her. But she didn't let go of the shard. She didn't stop. And then there was silence. The world around her seemed to stop. The shadows faded. The oppressive air lightened, and the temperature rose back to normal. The mirror, now nothing more than shards scattered across the floor, no longer glowed. Evelyn's form, once so vivid, so real, began to dissolve, her features melting into the air like mist. Rebecca gasped for breath, her body trembling from exhaustion. She could hear nothing but the pounding of her own heart, the sound of the hotel settling around her. The curse was broken. The mirror was shattered. And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, she was free. But as the silence stretched on, Rebecca realized something. She was not alone. From the corner of the
room, a faint, ghostly figure began to take shape. It was Evelyn, but not Evelyn as she had been.
This form was translucent, faint, like a fleeting memory, drifting toward her with an almost peaceful grace. Evelyn's voice was barely a whisper, like a sigh in the wind. "Thank you." And then, as quickly as she had appeared, Evelyn faded, completely, her form dissolving into nothingness. Rebecca sat there, the shard still clutched in her hand, as the weight of what had happened settled around her. The hotel was silent. The curse was broken. The darkness was gone. But something in Rebecca's soul had shifted. Something had been left behind. She stood, her legs weak but determined, and walked toward the door of room 306. It opened with a simple turn of the knob, and she stepped out into the empty hallway. The hotel was no longer a prison, but Rebecca knew she would never be the same. The hallway stretched out before Rebecca like a dark artery, its silence oppressive, almost suffocating. It was as if the hotel itself had become part of the void, the walls thick with an absence that pressed against her chest. Her feet echoed on the creaky floorboards, the sound of her own movement the only thing that broke the stillness. Room 306, now behind her, had seemed to melt into the building, leaving only the remnants of a dark memory. The door had closed with a simple click, as if the hotel itself had decided it was time to move on. The feeling of the curse, that oppressive force that had lived in the walls, had dissipated like fog in the morning sun. Yet Rebecca knew, deep in her bones, that nothing would ever be the same. She had walked away from the mirror, from Evelyn, from the madness that had consumed this place. She had freed herself. But at what cost? Her eyes flicked toward the staircase at the end of the hall. The low hum of the air conditioner buzzed faintly overhead, a normal, mundane sound that seemed out of place in the heavy silence. But there was something wrong in the air, something still lurking. Rebecca paused. She felt it, a faint pull, a sensation that something was watching her, waiting for her. The feeling wasn't as sharp as before, not the suffocating grip of the curse, but it was there. Just below the surface, like a shadow at the edge of her vision, a subtle distortion in the air around her. She swallowed, suddenly aware of the room behind her, and her thoughts clung to the silence that had replaced the cries of Evelyn. Had the haunting really ended, or had something else been left behind? Something far more insidious, something that couldn't be destroyed as easily as the curse itself. As if to answer her question, a distant sound broke the quiet, a faint, almost imperceptible creaking, like a door opening on its own. Her head snapped toward the source, but the hallway remained empty, the lights flickering ever so slightly above her. But then, there it was again, a soft creak, a movement, something shifting just beyond the corner, at the far end of the hall. Rebecca's heart lurched. The air grew thicker again, colder, as though the hotel was slowly drawing her back into its clutches. The shadows stretched in strange, unnatural ways along the walls, and for a moment she could have sworn she saw the faint outline of someone or something lurking in the dark. With slow, deliberate steps, she made her way toward the source of the noise, her pulse quickening with every footfall. The hallway stretched out before her like an endless tunnel, each step feeling heavier than the last, as though the air itself was growing more oppressive. Her breath caught as she neared the corner. The low hum of the lights above seemed to pulse, with an eerie rhythm, as if the hotel itself was alive, waiting. She hesitated, one hand brushing against the cold, peeling wallpaper, feeling the faint vibrations under her fingers. She paused at the corner, pressing herself against the wall, her heart hammering in her chest. The sound came again. Creak. And then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw it. A figure standing at the far end of the hallway, just beyond the reach of the light. A shadow, tall, slender, and unmistakably human, stood there, unmoving, watching her. Rebecca froze, her blood running cold. Her mind screamed for her to turn, to run, but her body refused to obey. The figure was still, too still. The long, dark shape was outlined against the faint glow of the distant light, but there was something wrong with it. Its proportions were distorted, the edges of its form rippling as though it were not quite real. For a moment, Rebecca wondered if she were seeing things, if her mind had fractured under the weight of everything she had endured. The ghost of Evelyn, the endless horrors that had surrounded room 306, the unending pressing weight of this place, but the figure didn't move. It simply waited. Rebecca swallowed. Hello? Her voice sounded weak in the silence. It cracked as she spoke, like the echo of a broken promise. The figure didn't respond. Rebecca took a tentative step forward, her feet dragging like they were stuck in quicksand. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back, to run, to get as far away from this place as possible, but something held her there. A pull, a tug, deep in her chest, as though the hotel itself was calling to her. The darkness ahead seemed to beckon, drawing her closer. Her hands trembled as she took another step and another. The figure remained still, watching, as if waiting for her to reach it. The shadows surrounding it grew darker, thicker, as though they were drawing in the light itself. The further she went, the harder it became to see. The figure was no longer just a shadow. It was a presence, something dark and cold that seemed to absorb the very warmth of her body. And then, in a heartbeat, the figure moved. It stepped forward faster than Rebecca could react, its long limbs stretching unnaturally, its body contorting with a sickening snap, as though its bones were breaking and reforming in the darkness. Its face, if it had one, was hidden in the folds of shadow, its features shifting like smoke. "You can't escape," the voice came, but it wasn't Evelyn's voice. It was deeper, darker, filled with an unnatural, malevolent resonance. The words echoed in Rebecca's skull, vibrating her very bones. The figure took another step, and the hallway seemed to stretch further, impossibly longer, the walls closing. In around her, pushing her toward it. She stumbled backward, her legs threatening to give out beneath her. Her breath was ragged, panic crawling up her throat. "You should have never left," the figure hissed, its voice now a distorted, guttural growl that sent a wave of icy terror through Rebecca. "The curse doesn't end, Rebecca. It only shifts." The darkness around her thickened, swallowing the light whole, and Rebecca realized with a sickening jolt that the shadows were no longer just shadows. They were alive. They were part of it. Part of the curse. And it wasn't just Evelyn that had been bound to this place, it was the hotel itself. The very structure had become a vessel for something older, something darker, something that fed on the souls of those who dared to step inside. Rebecca's body refused to move, her legs shaking, her mind paralyzed with dread. The figure drew closer, its form distorting, stretching until it loomed over her. A black void that seemed to consume everything in its wake. And then, as it reached out for her, its hand clawed, twisted, gripped her wrist with a force that burned like ice. Her scream was cut short as the darkness around her closed in, a final, suffocating embrace. But just as she felt herself slipping away, a familiar voice echoed in the depths of her mind. "You don't have to do this, Evelyn." Her voice, soft but clear, cutting through the terror. Rebecca forced her eyes open, her heart a frantic drumbeat in her chest. She wasn't alone. She wasn't completely lost. She had a choice. With the last of her strength, she pushed. She fought against the cold grip of the shadow, her body straining against the darkness that clung to her skin. She remembered the shard of glass, the power she had used to shatter the curse. She wasn't helpless. She could escape. With a final, desperate scream, Rebecca tore herself free from the figure's grip, stumbling backward into the light. She spun around, her legs barely holding her, and ran. She didn't know if it was the curse, the hotel, or the darkness that was chasing her, but she ran. And when she reached the exit, when she burst through the door, gasping for breath, heart racing, she knew one thing for certain. The hotel would never truly let her go. The darkness was still there, waiting. And as the door slammed behind her, sealing her fate, Rebecca knew the haunting had only just begun. Rebecca barely had time to catch her breath before the world around her shifted. The cold air of the hotel lobby felt like a slap, as though it were waking her from a nightmare that had never truly ended. Her legs were trembling beneath her, and her body ached as though she had run a marathon. But as she stood in the middle of the lobby, her eyes wide and frantic, she knew something had changed. The hotel, with its heavy air and strange shadows, was no longer just a place. It had become something more, something that twisted the very laws of reality. It was a living thing, feeding on the anguish and sorrow of everyone who passed through its doors. And now Rebecca understood. The hotel wasn't finished with her. As she turned to look back at the door she had just exited, she realized with a growing sense of horror that the lobby was not as it seemed. The walls, once dusty and faded, now seemed too pristine, the ornate chandeliers above her casting a warm, inviting glow that made the space feel unnaturally comfortable. But there was something wrong about that comfort. It was hollow. Her pulse quickened. Something was waiting for her, and it wasn't just the figure from the hallway. Rebecca stepped forward, her movements slow, almost hesitant, as though she were walking in a dream. She knew the hotel had released her, but something deep inside her whispered that she wasn't truly free. The walls of the lobby stretched out before her like the corridors of a forgotten maze, the air thick with the same scent of mildew and dust she had felt just moments before in room 306. The familiar silence pressed against her ears, thick and oppressive, and then the door behind her creaked open. Her body froze. She couldn't bring herself to turn around, couldn't face whatever might be waiting for her. But the pull was undeniable. Her hand, without her command, slowly turned the doorknob. As it clicked open, the shadows beyond the door seemed to breathe. Rebecca. Her name, so soft, so insistent, drifted through the air like a whisper on the wind. The voice was Evelyn's, but it sounded different. It was no longer the voice of a tormented soul asking for release. It was colder, more distant, as if Evelyn were not the one speaking at all. Rebecca turned, and there at the threshold of the door stood the figure again, the one from the hallway, the one who had pursued her through the darkness. The shadows writhed around its form, swirling like a storm contained in a single place. It was no longer just a vague shape, but a solid presence. Its face was an abstract mass of writhing darkness, devoid of features, its eyes two glowing, empty sockets. The room behind it was black, a void that seemed to devour the light in front of her. "Come back," the figure said, its voice like gravel, like something dragged from the depths of the earth. "You can't run from what you've seen." Rebecca took a step back, her heart thundering in her chest. But as her feet moved, the shadows seemed to grow longer, darker, stretching across the floor, wrapping themselves around her ankles, pulling at her like 1,000 cold hands. "No," Rebecca whispered, her voice trembling. She didn't want to go back. She couldn't. She had fought too hard to leave. She had escaped, but the shadows were closing in. The figure in the doorway took a step forward, its presence growing larger, more suffocating. "You will always return here," it rasped. "This place doesn't let go of those it calls. You think you are free, but the curse is in you now, in your blood." Rebecca tried to step away, but the shadows yanked at her, binding her to the spot. It felt as though the very ground was pulling her back, forcing her to look at the thing in the doorway. The figure's presence was overwhelming, its sheer size blotting out the light behind it. "You're still bound to this place," it hissed. "The hotel is not finished with you, and neither am I." It stretched its hand toward her, long, twisted fingers reaching out to claim her. Every part of Rebecca screamed at her to run, to escape, to not let this thing touch her. But her body was frozen, her mind clouded by the weight of fear and exhaustion. "No." She breathed again, her voice cracking. She was almost too weak to speak, but she knew one thing for certain. She would
Not be taken again. Not by this thing, not by the hotel.
A sudden, sharp clarity flooded through her. She realized with a horrifying certainty that the curse of room 306 had not been destroyed. It had merely shifted. She had not ended the nightmare. She had only postponed it. The hotel was alive, and it had never let her go. Her hands, weak but determined, reached into her pocket. She still had the shard of glass, the one she had used to destroy the mirror, the one that had once shattered the curse. Without hesitation, Rebecca pulled the shard free, the cold glass now feeling like the only thing that could keep her from the abyss. "No," the figure whispered, its voice now rising into a hiss, a screech of warning. "You cannot fight me." Rebecca's pulse was a steady drumbeat in her ears, the glass shard trembling in her hand as she stepped forward. "Watch me," she muttered under her breath. With all the strength she had left, Rebecca hurled the shard of glass at the figure, her hand shaking with the effort. It was a desperate move, an act of defiance, but it was all she had left. Time seemed to freeze. The shard sliced through the air, glowing with a brief, strange light, and then struck the figure dead in the center of its chest. A loud, guttural roar erupted from the figure as the shard sank into it, causing the darkness around it to ripple, as though the very fabric of reality were tearing. For a brief moment, Rebecca thought it might be over. She thought she might be free. But then the figure screamed in agony and the room around her began to distort. The walls cracked, the floor trembled beneath her feet. The shadows surged violently toward her like a tidal wave of darkness, and Rebecca stumbled backward, her heart racing. "You can't escape," the figure growled one last time, its voice now a twisted mockery of the one that had chased her before. "You belong here." Rebecca's body was being pulled, the shadows dragging her toward the open doorway. She felt the shards of glass at her fingertips slip free, leaving her vulnerable, exposed. She could feel the walls of the hotel closing in on her once again, the darkness suffocating like the claws of some ancient beast. But then something unexpected happened. A soft, flickering light appeared in the distance. At first it seemed so small, so far away, but it was growing. Brighter, stronger. The warmth of it pushed against the coldness that had surrounded her. It was a voice, soft and gentle. Rebecca. Her heart surged. She knew that voice. She had heard it before. "Evelyn?" she whispered, her voice hoarse. The light grew stronger, enveloping her, filling the hallway with warmth. The darkness around her began to retreat, the shadows falling back, shriveling under the brightness. The figure screamed again, but this time it was no longer with the same power. It was with fear. Rebecca reached out toward the light. "Rebecca, let go. Let go of the curse, let go of the hotel." With every ounce of will she had left, she stepped forward, her hand stretching toward the warmth. The darkness receded further, and the shadows clung to the walls, no longer able to hold her. And then, with one final, desperate cry from the figure, it was gone. Rebecca stood alone in the hallway, the hotel now eerily quiet. The light that had filled the space was fading, but it had left something behind. Peace. The feeling of being free. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Rebecca felt the weight lift. The hotel's presence, its hold on her, was gone. The curse had been broken. She stood, breathless but free at the threshold of the door, the world outside beckoning. The door opened before her, not with a creak, but with a gentle push, as if the hotel itself had decided to let her go. And as she stepped through the threshold into the unknown, she knew one thing for certain. She had finally escaped. Freedom was not the sensation Rebecca expected. She had stepped out of the Dunridge Hotel with the heaviness of a survivor. Her body still trembling, her breath shallow, her heart bruised but beating. The wind outside bit at her skin, cool and sharp, real, and the ordinary sounds of the street beyond the hotel's doorstep felt too bright, too alive, after the darkness she had left behind. The sky was still dark, the pre-dawn hour stretching across the city like a veil. The lights from distant windows flickered with the mundane beauty of life continuing. Cars passed. A drunk man sang softly to himself on the opposite sidewalk. Somewhere, a dog barked. The world had not paused for her nightmare. It never did. Rebecca wrapped her arms around herself, drawing in the cool air like a balm. Her mind tried to make sense of what she'd endured, tried to wrap itself around the impossible. The mirror, the figure, Evelyn, the curse. It was real. All of it. And yet, standing here now, everything about the world seemed indifferent to the horrors, still lingering inside her. But the curse had been broken, hadn't it? The question needled her. She turned to look back at the hotel. The Dunridge loomed behind her, old and unremarkable. its facade cracked and fading. The windows were dark. The entrance sign buzzed faintly. It looked like any other aging building in the city, and yet her stomach turned as she stared at the third floor, at the window just above the main entrance. She knew, without seeing, which one it was. Room 306. No light, no shadow, just the window, still, watching. She shook her head and forced herself to walk, each step carrying her further away from the hotel. It would take time, perhaps a lifetime, to process what had happened, to separate reality from the unspeakable. She would never go back. That was the only promise she could keep. But as Rebecca turned the corner and the hotel disappeared behind brick and lamplight, she didn't see the curtain in room 306 flutter. She didn't feel the air ripple. She didn't hear the soft voice that whispered through the window, "You left the door open." The first 3 days passed in a haze. Rebecca returned to her apartment, a quiet fourth-floor unit that now felt unfamiliar. Her bed was too soft, her hallway too narrow. The bathroom mirror caught her reflection in strange ways, as if it expected to find someone else there. Sleep came in jagged fragments. When it did, she dreamed. She dreamed of flickering lights, of red dresses swaying in the dark, of shadows pressing against glass, of hallways that stretched impossibly long, ending in doors that pulsed like hearts. She'd wake with sweat on her brow, the sound of distant sobbing fading from her ears. But the worst part wasn't the dreams. It was the things she couldn't explain. The footsteps in her hallway when no one else was home. The faint tapping at her window, even on the fourth floor. The way her bathroom mirror sometimes showed a figure just behind her, gone the moment she turned. The television turned on by itself once, just static, a soft crying buried beneath the white noise. She unplugged it. The next night, it turned on again, and always, the faintest whisper just as she was drifting off. Rebecca. She told herself it was trauma, sleep deprivation, the aftershock of being pushed too far, seeing too much, hallucinations, residual stress. That's what any therapist would say. But deep down, she knew the truth. She had brought something back. The turning point came on the 7th night. She had just turned off the lights. Her apartment was quiet, too quiet. The kind of silence that pulses in your ears, where you can hear your heartbeat in your throat. The city beyond her window had gone still. No sirens, no traffic, no wind. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, counting her breaths, and then creak from the hallway. She sat up, another creak, this time closer. Rebecca's skin prickled. She didn't move. Her heart pounded in her chest. She told herself it was the building settling. Old wood, bad insulation, until she heard the whisper. "Don't close the door." Her mouth went dry. Slowly, inch by inch, she turned toward her. Bedroom door, it was open, but she had closed it. She always closed it. The lock was automatic. She remembered the click. She rose, feet bare against the floor, and stepped into the hallway. Darkness met her. But there, at the end of the hallway, was the mirror. A full-length antique she had bought at a second-hand store years ago. It shouldn't have been reflective in the dark, but it was. And in the reflection, she saw the hallway behind her, and herself, and just behind her shoulder, a figure, tall, shifting, featureless. Rebecca spun. Nothing. The hallway was empty. She turned back to the mirror. The figure was still there. Closer now, its arms stretched downward, limp, its head tilted at a sickening angle. Behind its formless body, the hallway in the mirror began to change. It wasn't her apartment anymore. It was the Dunridge. Room 306, the bed, the peeling wallpaper, the flickering light. It had returned. Or she had. Her throat closed. Her body locked in place. She reached toward the mirror, fingers trembling, heart cracking against her ribs like a bird trying to escape its cage, and just as her fingers brushed the glass, the reflection smiled. She screamed, and the mirror cracked. Just one thin crack. From corner to corner, a silent fracture, and then silence. She didn't sleep that night. She didn't speak to anyone the next day. But she knew the curse had not ended. It had followed her. No, worse. It had chosen her. The hotel was no longer a place. It was a state, a presence that lived inside her now. It whispered behind every silence, watched through every reflection, waited. She would never go back to room 306 because room 306 had come with her. It lived in her mirrors, in her dreams, in her mind. And every night the whisper came, soft, delicate, patient. I'm still waiting. The morning sun filtered weakly through the curtains of Rebecca's apartment, but it did little to warm the cold that had settled deep within her. She sat at the kitchen table, the empty mug before her untouched, her fingers trembling as she held it, unable to bring it to her lips. Her eyes drifted toward the window, the faint shadows cast by the city outside offering no comfort. Her reflection in the glass seemed too distant, too removed, an observer to a life she no longer felt a part of. The curse was not something that could be easily erased, she had learned. It wasn't a single event. It wasn't just room 306 or Evelyn's vengeful spirit. It was a part of her now, woven into her very essence. The whispers were a constant hum in the back of her mind. The feeling of eyes watching her never went away, even in the most mundane of moments. She had tried to move on, to return to some semblance of normalcy, but it was a lie. Every step she took, every moment of silence, was fractured by the knowledge that room 306 was still there, waiting. Her reflection in mirrors had begun to feel like a foreign entity. It was always there, watching, even when she wasn't looking. She couldn't escape it. She couldn't escape them. She couldn't escape herself. Her therapist had tried to help her understand what had happened. "You've endured trauma," Dr. Hayes had said gently, her voice full of that professional calm. The mind creates these visions, these illusions to deal with intense stress. It's common after a significant experience. Your brain is just trying to make sense of everything. Rebecca had nodded, forcing the tears back. But deep down, she knew the truth. It wasn't an illusion, it wasn't trauma, it was real. She had seen room 306 in her mind's eye more times than she cared to count. She'd seen Evelyn's face, her outstretched hands, her empty eyes, every time she closed her eyes, every time she looked into a reflective surface. Rebecca stood, abruptly the chair scraping against the floor. The mug remained untouched. She couldn't sit still anymore. The house felt like a cage. Every corner, every surface, every room seemed to hum with that same oppressive energy. Her fingers reached toward the hallway mirror again, always the mirrors. Just a glance, she told herself. She walked down the narrow hallway, past the door, to the bathroom, the bedroom, the clutter of the living room. The mirror loomed at the end of the hall, framed in gold, reflective and cold. Every day she passed it, she could feel it. Every step felt like a slow crawl into an unseen abyss. With a sharp inhale, she stood in front of it. Her eyes locked on her reflection. It was her, but not. Her own features seemed unfamiliar. Her hair was out of place, her skin too pale. And then, just as it always happened, the whisper came. "Rebecca." She flinched. She couldn't move. She didn't want to look again, but she couldn't tear her eyes away. The figure began to take shape. At first, it was just a blur, dark, indistinct, pressing against the edges of the mirror. Then, like smoke filling a room, it solidified. There, standing behind her, was the figure, tall, elongated, and twisted. It was the same figure she had seen when she was trapped in the hotel. But now, it was even more distorted. Its features were malleable, shifting as though it were not quite human, not quite there. Its eyes were hollow, its mouth split into a jagged grin, and its limbs seemed to stretch unnaturally as it moved toward her in the reflection. "I'm still here," it hissed. Its voice was no longer just a whisper, but an overwhelming, suffocating presence. "You cannot escape. Not now. Not ever." Her breath caught in her throat, and for a moment Rebecca couldn't breathe. She felt herself being pulled into the reflection, her body moving toward it as though an invisible force were drawing her in. The mirror was no longer just a surface, it was a doorway. The figure stepped closer in the glass, its form now perfectly mirrored, its eyes glowing like twin lanterns, cold and soulless. She took a step back, heart racing. "Come to me," the figure whispered, its voice dripping with malice. "You left the door open, Rebecca, and now I'll come through." Her breath quickened. She was paralyzed. The room around her blurred, the edges of her vision fading as the figure in the mirror grew larger, closer, and then it reached out. The air turned cold, so cold that Rebecca could see her breath misting in front of her face, a sharp, biting cold, the hand in the mirror stretched outward, its fingers cracking, elongating with an unnatural snap. It was coming for her. Rebecca tried to move, but her legs wouldn't obey. She was stuck, rooted in place by the weight of its stare. The cold was unbearable. The walls around her felt like they were shifting, closing in. The darkness behind the figure in the mirror began to pool, growing darker and deeper like a void. Just before the hand could reach her, Rebecca did the only thing she could think of. She slammed her hand into the mirror. It shattered in an instant. The eye, glass exploded outward with a deafening crack. Shards flew across the room, embedding themselves in the walls, the floor, her skin. She cried out, but the sound was drowned out by the sharp, violent crash of the breaking glass. The room went silent. For a moment, Rebecca couldn't breathe, couldn't see. The shards embedded in her hand burned, but she didn't care. She could barely feel the pain over the overwhelming rush of adrenaline flooding her system. The mirror was gone. The reflection was gone. The figure, gone. But then, from the darkened corner of her apartment, a familiar, haunting voice slithered from the shadows. "You can't break me, Rebecca. Not anymore." Rebecca spun around, but there was nothing there. Nothing except the faint sound of soft sobbing, growing louder, echoing in the empty space. And suddenly the apartment, her sanctuary, began to feel just as oppressive, just as cursed as room 306 had been. The walls seemed to close in on her once more. Her breath caught in her throat, the weight of what was happening settling over her. The whisper was getting louder. The sobs were growing more. Desperate, the figure was still inside her, and the curse had come with her. It had always been waiting for her, hiding in the reflection, waiting for the right moment to break through. Rebecca turned toward the hallway door. She couldn't stay here. She couldn't stay in this house, in this place that had once felt like home. She ran, not even sure where she was going, only knowing one thing. The Dunridge had never really let her go, and room 306 had followed her, its whispers never ceasing. Its presence would never leave her. Rain poured in heavy sheets as Rebecca stumbled through the city streets, soaked to the bone, her coat clinging to her like a second skin. Her hair plastered to her face. Her breath came in ragged gasps, each one sharp against the cold. Her fingers were bloodied where the mirror shards had bitten into her skin, and the gash along her palm had begun to throb with a dull, relentless ache. But she didn't stop. She couldn't. She didn't know where she was running. Only that she had to get away, away from her apartment, away from the mirror, away from it. But no matter how far she ran, the whisper stayed with her, soft and persistent, curling in her ear like a strand of wet hair. "You brought me with you. It repeated over and over, threading its way through her thoughts, soothing and cruel. She ducked into a narrow alley, her back pressed against the cold brick wall, the downpour muffled by the overhang above her. The city's lights shimmered in the puddles, distorted and unreal. Somewhere nearby, a siren wailed. Thunder rolled low, like a beast turning over in its sleep. Rebecca slid down the wall until she was sitting on the damp ground, her knees pulled to her chest, her injured hand cradled in her lap. The blood had begun to dry, flaking down her wrist in rust-colored trails. She looked up at the cracked window across from her, the glass warped with age, her reflection stared back. At first it seemed normal, tired, pale, wrecked. But then the reflection blinked, and she didn't. Rebecca's stomach turned. Her reflection tilted its head slowly, lips curling into a subtle, sickening grin. And then, just as she reached for her eyes, just as she blinked, the reflection mouthed the words, "Come back!" Lightning flashed, and in that split second of brightness, Rebecca saw something behind the glass. A figure, tall, black, featureless, watching. She bolted. She didn't remember walking to the old library, but somehow, there she was. The Dunridge. City Archives building stood at the edge of the historic district, abandoned since the early 2000s after a fire took out the upper floors. A forgotten husk of municipal history, sealed up behind rusted chains and city-issued "Do Not Enter" signs. Rebecca climbed the gate like a woman possessed. Inside, the air was thick with dust and mold. The scent was earthy and rotten, like something buried long ago that had never stopped decaying. Her shoes crunched on broken plaster and bits of charred ceiling as she wandered the ruined aisles of file cabinets and collapsed bookshelves. She didn't know why she was here, but something led her down into the belly of the building, into the lower levels, where the floor sagged and the ceiling pressed low, and every shadow felt like it was watching. Then she found it, an old metal drawer, bent and rusted shut. She wedged it open with a broken ruler. Inside was a file marked Dunridge Hotel. Building. Violations and incident reports. 1971, 1994. Her fingers trembled as she pulled the folder out. The paper was damp and yellowed, nearly falling apart in her hands. She flipped through. Reports of leaks, structural failures, electrical issues, and then a death certificate. Evelyn L. Graves. Died March 6, 1987, age 29. Blunt force trauma, due to fall from third-floor window. But there was more. Taped to the back of the report was a second certificate, not for Evelyn, for someone else. Lillian M. Graves died March 6, 1957, age 29. Asphyxiation due to hanging in hotel room 306, Rebecca.
Froze, 2 women.
Same last name, same room, same day, 30 years apart. She frantically flipped through the file again. Another incident, Margaret Graves, 1927, room 306, found dead in the bathtub. March 6th, over and over again. Graves, room 306, March 6th, over decades. Generations, a family line, a ritual, a legacy. The Graves women had been dying in that room for nearly a century, but Evelyn had been different. Evelyn hadn't just died there. She had fought it, broken the cycle, or tried to. But when Rebecca broke the mirror, she didn't destroy Evelyn's spirit. She absorbed it. The curse didn't end with Evelyn. It needed someone new, someone ready, someone fragile enough to believe she could save. The ghost. Rebecca's stomach turned. She wasn't just haunted, she was next. That night the dreams returned, but this time she wasn't in room 306. She was beneath it, trapped in the floorboards. She couldn't move, couldn't scream. She felt wood pressing against her chest, nails in her hands. Her body contorted in angles that weren't human. Around her, the muffled sounds of footsteps, weeping, and the scratch, scratch, scratch of something digging. In the dream. She looked up and saw a slit of light. Through it, she saw herself, standing over the bed, wearing the red dress, her own face, smiling and whispering, "It's your turn now." She woke screaming. Blood on her sheets, a splinter beneath her skin, and just before the light of dawn breached the window, the walls around her sighed, as though the house itself had taken a breath. From the mirror, her reflection smiled and whispered, "March 6th is coming." Rebecca couldn't shake the feeling that she was sinking. The days had bled into one another. She couldn't tell if it was the trauma of the curse or something more. Her mind breaking under the weight of it all. She was slipping into something dark, something familiar yet strange, like a nightmare that reached out and caught her even when her eyes were open. The whispers were louder now, and March 6th was coming. It was all she could think about. Every hour, every minute, the calendar pressed itself against her mind. The days felt like a countdown, and every night when she lay in her bed, she felt the eyes of room 306 staring back at her, watching. Her even when she wasn't near the hotel. Waiting. The worst part was that she was beginning to understand. The Graves women, Evelyn, Lillian, Margaret, they hadn't just been victims of the curse. They were part of it. The hotel's madness fed off their grief, their rage, and each of their deaths had carved another layer into the building, made it stronger, more insistent. It was feeding on the pain of the Graves family, yes, but it had also been feeding on Rebecca. She had unknowingly joined that family, connected by bloodlines twisted by the hotel's hunger. The curse had found her. Rebecca could feel it now, like a pressure against her chest. She wasn't just haunted by the dead. She was becoming one of them. It was 3:47 a.m. on the morning of March 6th when Rebecca's phone rang. The ringtone was jarring, slicing through the silence of her apartment. It felt too loud, too real, pulling her out of the fog she had been walking through. Her hands were shaking when she reached for the phone, the screen flickering in her grip. A single name blinked on the display. Evelyn Graves, Rebecca's. Heart skipped a beat. Her thumb hovered over the screen, but the call ended before she could answer. Her hands felt clammy and cold, but she managed to swipe across the screen to see if there was a message. There was nothing, just the missed call. She sat there for a moment, staring at the phone, waiting for something, anything else. Her breath came in shallow bursts. She could hear the sound of her own pulse pounding in her ears, and then it started. A soft, insistent sound, too faint at first to recognize, like a hum that vibrated through the walls, the floorboards, the air itself. And then came the crying. It wasn't muffled or distant anymore. It was right there, right in the room with her. The sound was sharp, raw, and unmistakably human. The sobs echoed through her apartment, each one louder than the last, like a chorus of voices trapped within the walls. She stood up, her legs unsteady beneath her. The tears she had been holding back for so long were rising again, swelling in her chest. No, not again, but she knew. She knew this was the beginning. She had been waiting for it in the back of her mind ever since the curse had first claimed her. She knew the moment she had stepped into the Dunridge Hotel, she had been marked. The whispers were louder now, because March 6th had arrived. It wasn't just a date, it wasn't just an anniversary, it was the threshold. It was the night the curse had fed, and Rebecca was the final meal. The crying stopped. Silence. For a moment she thought she could hear her heart beating in her ears again. But then, the floor beneath her feet shifted. It was subtle at first, barely noticeable. A vibration. But then it came again. The sound of something scraping underneath her floorboards. Something desperate, hungry, clawing at the wood like a thing trapped beneath the earth. Rebecca's breath caught in her throat as the room shuddered. The walls breathed. They expanded, then contracted like lungs taking in air. The floor groaned beneath her feet, as if something ancient were stirring below. She stumbled backward, her eyes wide. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. Everything inside her screamed to run, but she knew it was too late for that. She was already in it, trapped. The hotel had come to her, and now its hunger was hers. Rebecca pressed herself against the wall, trying to steady her breathing, trying to ignore the scraping beneath her, the relentless thumping as something, or someone, tried to break through. Her hands reached for her phone, dialing the first number that came to mind, Dr. Hayes. But the call never went through. The connection was lost in the static, the signal cutting out, leaving only an oppressive silence. The sound beneath her feet grew louder. She pressed her hands against her ears to block it out, but it was no use. The walls around her were alive. They were breathing, shifting, groaning like a thing with purpose. It was then that she realized the truth. The hotel, the curse, wasn't just in room 306 anymore. It had taken root in her life, in the very fabric of her existence. The hotel was inside her. A low crack echoed through the apartment. And then the floor buckled. Rebecca screamed as the boards beneath her feet splintered, and with a terrifying, sickening lurch, she fell. She tumbled downward, her body twisting in midair, the air rushing past her. She hit the ground hard. Her body screamed as the pain rushed through her, but she barely felt it as the darkness closed in around her. When she opened her eyes, she was no longer in her apartment. She was back. She was in room 306. The room had changed since the last time she had seen it. It was even darker now, the air colder, heavier, with a presence that had only grown more powerful over time. The bed was still there, perfectly made, but the walls had become warped, the floorboards cracked. The mirror that had once been shattered was now whole again, gleaming like the surface of a stagnant pool. The shadows in the corners were thicker, denser. And standing before her, as if it had always been waiting, was Evelyn. Her figure was no longer translucent, but solid. Her dress, once red, was now blackened, torn, as if it had been through something far worse than just death. Her eyes, those hollow, empty eyes, met Rebecca's with an intensity that seemed to pierce her soul. "I told you," Evelyn whispered, her voice no longer pleading but triumphant. "You can't escape. You never will." Rebecca's breath caught in her throat. She tried to move, but her body wouldn't obey. She was trapped. Evelyn's smile stretched wider. The air grew colder. The shadows in the corners seemed to swell with life, and then the floor beneath Rebecca's feet began to crack. Rebecca stood frozen in the heart of room 306, her body trembling but unable to move. Evelyn's presence loomed before her, stronger than ever, her dark, hollow eyes boring into Rebecca's very soul. The room had transformed since the last time Rebecca had been here. It felt alive now. Its walls were breathing, the floorboards groaning under the weight of a presence that had been waiting for this very moment. The air was thick with something malevolent, something ancient. Rebecca could feel the floor beneath, her feet crack, the very foundation of the room shifting as though it had been waiting for her return. Her skin prickled with the oppressive weight of the curse, the echo of every death that had been absorbed by this room, this hotel, over the decades. Evelyn smiled, her lips stretching wider, her form now solid, no longer a mere wisp of a ghost. She had returned fully, but she was no longer the broken woman Rebecca had encountered in the reflection. She was something darker, something more powerful. "You never had a chance, Rebecca," Evelyn whispered, her voice cold and final. Her words, cutting through the heavy silence like a blade. "You were always meant to be a part of this, always meant to finish what I started." Rebecca's heart pounded in her chest, the air around her thickening with each breath. She tried to speak, but her mouth was dry, her voice a mere rasp. She wanted to scream, to run, to fight, anything to escape the suffocating grip of the curse. But every movement felt too slow, too heavy. It was as though the room itself was holding her captive, her body unwilling to obey. "I broke the cycle," Evelyn continued, her eyes glinting with dark satisfaction. "But the hotel wasn't finished. It needs someone who can accept what's been handed to them. And you, Rebecca, are the one it chose. You are the one who will carry the weight of this place forward." Rebecca could feel the tears stinging her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She couldn't let herself break. Not now. She had fought so hard to escape the curse, to leave the hotel behind. But it was here, with her, it was never really gone. The shadows in the room pressed in on her, cold fingers creeping around her body, constricting her chest. Suddenly, the floor beneath her feet cracked open, splintering with a loud, bone-chilling snap. Rebecca stumbled back, her breath catching in her throat as the darkness beneath the floor seemed to swallow everything. It was a black pit, deep and endless, yawning beneath her like an abyss. The shadows reached out, swirling like tendrils, and Rebecca could feel the weight of them, pressing against her legs, pulling her toward the dark, gaping hole. "No!" she gasped, her voice a desperate plea. But Evelyn only laughed, a soft, cruel sound that reverberated around the room, growing louder until it consumed everything. The shadows tightened their grip, dragging Rebecca toward the pit. Her heart raced, her breath shallow as she fought with everything she had to break free. But the more she struggled, the tighter the shadows pulled. They were everywhere now, suffocating her, wrapping around her legs, her arms, her throat. "You're mine now," Evelyn's voice whispered from behind her, a seductive promise. "You can't escape. The hotel has you. The curse has you." With a final, desperate gasp, Rebecca fought against the shadows, pushing her hands against the ground, trying to claw her way out. Her fingers scraped against the wood, leaving deep, bloody marks. But it was no use. The darkness was closing in. The weight of the curse was too much. The pull of the shadows was too strong. And then, a sudden blinding light filled the room. Rebecca cried out, shielding her eyes as the intense brightness illuminated the room. The shadows recoiled, shrieking in agony as the light burned them. Away, the tendrils of darkness vanishing into the air like smoke. Evelyn screamed, her form writhing as the light intensified. Her face twisted in pain, her body dissolving into shadows before finally disappearing entirely, her voice lingering in the air like a final, haunting echo. "No, no, I won't let you go." But the light consumed her. The room fell silent. Rebecca's body went limp, the crushing pressure of the curse lifting like a heavy weight being pulled off her shoulders. Her heart raced, but she could finally breathe. The room 306, was still. The shadows were gone. The oppressive air had vanished, leaving only an eerie calm. Rebecca collapsed to the floor, her body trembling from the exertion. She could feel the burn of the glass shards in her hand, the blood still fresh on her skin. But it didn't matter now. The hotel was silent. The curse was broken. At least that's what she told herself. Hours later, when the sun finally rose, Rebecca found herself standing at the edge of the street, her body aching from the weight of everything that had happened. The sky was still dark with the remnants of the storm, but the air felt fresh, clean. The rain had stopped, leaving a quiet stillness in the world. She had made it out. She had broken the curse. But as she stood there, the shadows of the city stretched before her, long and haunting. And for the briefest of moments, she saw something in the corner of her eye, a flicker of movement in a window. Room 306. It wasn't over. It never would be. Rebecca turned away, her legs shaking beneath her, her body exhausted from everything she had endured. The whispers were still there, lingering just beneath the surface. But they were quieter now, more distant. The hotel was no longer pulling at her, but she knew, in the deepest part of herself, that it would never fully let go. She had escaped room 306. She had survived the curse. But the hotel, the curse, it had left something behind. It had left her changed. And somewhere, deep in the shadows, she knew that the hotel was still waiting for the next person to step into its grip. But that wouldn't be her. She was done running. She was done being afraid. And for the first time in a long while, Rebecca felt the faintest flicker of hope. The hotel had lost. She had won. For now. But as she stepped forward, into the world beyond the hotel's grip, she couldn't shake the feeling that no matter how far she ran, room 306 would always be there. In the mirrors. In the dark waiting. You're deep into the story now, and the horrors are only escalating. If you're still with us, don't forget to like and subscribe. Tell us where you're listening from in the comments. Who else is staying up late to face this nightmare? Settle in. The terror continues. Story 2. The night felt unnatural, thick with a silence that pressed into Marcus's ears. The air, tinged with the faint smell of damp concrete and the distant echo of an abandoned mall, hung heavy around him. The clattering of his boots on the polished floor echoed too loud in the dead stillness of the underground parking lot. Marcus pulled his jacket tighter against the chill, a chill that seemed too early for the season. But then again, nights had always been cold down here. Deep in the heart of the parking structure, the fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting pale, sickly light over the rows of parked cars. Even the steady hum of the lights, which would usually offer some kind of comfort, had a strained, uneasy tone to it. It was his last round of the night, the final check before he could finally lock up and go home to his bed. The thought of the quiet comfort of his bed, warm, soft, tempted him to rush through the last few minutes. But he'd learned long ago that rushing was never a good idea, not when you worked here. The underground parking lot of the old mall had been the site of numerous strange incidents over the years. People lost their way, misused the space, left their cars overnight for reasons that didn't quite add up. Most of the time, it was just the humdrum of guarding a forgotten space. But sometimes something felt different. He could feel the weight of the place in the pit of his stomach, the kind of sensation that made his shoulders tense without him realizing it. It was a building filled with memories, the ghosts of old shoppers, of long-forgotten weekends spent in this very spot, hiding under the surface like rot. And Marcus, ever the stoic, had become a part of the machinery. It was just a job, right? Something to pass the hours until morning. But tonight, something felt off. He passed the first row of parked cars, his flashlight's beam casting jagged shadows across the concrete. The walls seemed to pulse with an odd vibration, a low hum that was almost imperceptible. Almost. Marcus had worked the graveyard shift for years, but he couldn't remember ever hearing that sound before. It made the hairs on the back of his neck stand at attention. That's when he saw it, on the security monitor. A small rectangular image in the corner of the screen caught his eye. He froze in place. His heart skipped. He adjusted his view. In the far corner of the parking lot, next to an old sedan, a man stood motionless. His face was obscured by the shadows, but the way he stood, straight-backed, rigid, felt wrong. His posture was unnaturally still, as if he were suspended in time, waiting for something that had yet to come. Marcus leaned closer to the monitor, squinting. The man wasn't moving, not even a fraction of an inch. He'd been standing there for a while, But Marcus hadn't noticed him when he made his rounds. Why hadn't he noticed? He felt a twinge of unease creeping up his spine, but he shook it off. It was probably just a late-night wanderer who had gotten lost. The mall was always open late for a few diehards, and the parking lot was no stranger to stragglers. Nothing unusual about that. He glanced at the time on the screen. It was almost 2 a.m. The lot was empty. That's when he saw something else. A subtle but unmistakable shift. The man's form hadn't changed. There was no movement, no subtle bend of his knees, no shift of his weight. But the shadows around him seemed to deepen, swallowing him up more with each second. Something felt wrong. Marcus swallowed hard. He'd been trained to ignore the whispers of his instincts, to trust only what he could see. But this was different. Something lingered in the air, something he couldn't see but could feel, crawling across his skin. He shook his head, trying to clear the fog in his thoughts. With a decisive motion, Marcus stood up, pushing himself away from the monitor. "I'll check it out," he muttered to himself, grabbing his flashlight and slipping it into his coat pocket. There was no reason to make this a bigger deal than it was. He just needed to confirm that everything was fine. He'd confront the man, give him a gentle reminder about the mall's closing hours, and that would be the end of it. But as Marcus stepped into the hallway, the air grew colder. A biting chill that seemed to materialize out of nowhere, catching him off guard. The heat from his breath misted in the air, swirling like a fog before it vanished, swallowed by the cold. The chill didn't feel natural. The concrete beneath his feet felt colder than it should have, and Marcus's footsteps echoed strangely, bouncing back at him as if something were mimicking his movements. He grimaced and quickened his pace, moving deeper into the parking structure. The silence seemed almost oppressive now, as if the entire lot was holding its breath, waiting. Marcus rounded a corner and stopped. The man was still standing there, just as he had been on the monitor, motionless, still, unnaturally rigid. The beam of his flashlight cut through the dark, revealing the shape of a figure wearing a long coat, their hands hanging limply at their sides. The face was hidden in shadow, but the shape, it was wrong. There was something about it that didn't sit right with him. He should have called out, should have asked if the man needed help. But instead, all Marcus could do was stare. The man's stillness was unsettling, something almost otherworldly about it. He felt an itch at the back of his skull, a primal warning to stay away. But he had a job to do. Marcus took a step forward, his voice steady despite the unease gnawing at his insides. "Excuse me, sir. The mall's closed. You need to leave." The figure didn't react. Marcus took another step, and the temperature seemed to drop even further. The flashlight flickered in his hand, casting long shadows on the walls. For a moment, the shadows appeared to stretch unnaturally, as though they were alive, reaching for him. His stomach twisted. He forced himself to move closer, but still, the figure didn't budge. "Sir," Marcus called out again, his voice trembling slightly. His breath came out in short bursts, visible in the air. The moment he stepped closer, the air seemed to snap. The stillness felt suffocating, as though the world had suddenly gone utterly silent, as if time had frozen around him. His heartbeat echoed in his ears, louder than it should have been. Marcus hesitated, his gaze darting around the parking lot. The rows of empty vehicles were now just black, hulking shapes in the gloom. Everything felt too still, too heavy. The man still did not move. Marcus took another step forward, and that's when he saw it. The faintest movement, just a twitch at the edge of his vision. The figure shifted slightly, just enough for Marcus to notice. But when he looked directly at the figure, it was perfectly still again. Then the light in the parking lot flickered once, twice, before plunging the area into complete darkness. Everything inside Marcus screamed to run. He turned, to head back toward the exit, but something made him stop. Something in the air felt wrong, a presence, as if eyes were watching him, as if the shadows themselves were alive. And then, just as quickly as it had gone dark, the light returned. Only now, the man was gone. Marcus stood there frozen, the emptiness of the lot stretching out before him. Where had he gone? His heart pounded wildly, his breath shallow. For a long moment, all he could hear was the hammering of his own pulse in his ears. The air was still too cold, too thick. Something wasn't right. Marcus stood there in the sudden, oppressive silence, his heart pounding against his ribs. The sharp, biting cold wrapped itself around him like a vice. It was as though the very air in the parking lot had conspired against him, pressing in from all sides, thick and heavy, suffocating him with an unnatural chill that seemed to come from deep beneath the earth. The faint taste of metal lingered on his tongue, and he could feel the hairs on his neck standing up, an instinctual, primal reaction to a presence that was no longer simply wrong, but something far darker, far older than anything he had ever encountered. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself, but the air felt like ice in his lungs. He glanced at the empty rows of cars, now eerily silent, the shadows beneath them stretching long and unnatural. They seemed to shift slightly, as though they were no longer just the shadows of metal and glass, but something else, something that had begun to pulse with a life of its own. Marcus took a hesitant step forward, his flashlight trembling in his hand. The beam cut through the thick, suffocating darkness, casting fleeting pools of light onto the cold concrete, but the edges of the light seemed to curl and distort, bending in strange, fluid shapes. His breath escaped in jagged, foggy bursts, disappearing into the stifling air. The parking lot felt like a trap, a vast, empty space that had grown impossibly larger since the figure had disappeared. For a moment, he simply stood there, caught between the desire to flee and the compulsion to search, to find answers, to figure out what had just happened. His mind screamed at him to leave, to call the police, to get out. But something tugged at the back of his mind, an invisible force, drawing him deeper into the shadowed depths of the parking lot. Something wanted him to stay. He wasn't sure why, but he had to find out. Another glance at the security monitor in the office might reveal something more. Something he had missed, something that would explain what had just transpired. Marcus turned sharply on his heel and began walking toward the entrance to the security office. His footsteps echoed too loudly in the empty hall, the clack of his boots almost mocking him in the oppressive silence. The hallway stretched out before him, its lights flickering overhead. The hum of the fluorescent bulbs had grown louder, as though they were struggling to stay on, their weak buzzing vibrating through the floor beneath his feet. Every step seemed heavier than the last, as though something were pulling at him from below. He reached the small office and stepped inside. The moment he crossed the threshold, the cold intensified, settling over his skin like a freezing weight. The dim glow of the security monitors illuminated the room with a sickly greenish. He moved quickly to the desk, his hands shaking as he turned the dials to rewind the footage. The screen flickered momentarily, as if it were struggling to load, before settling into the video feed of the parking lot. Marcus's breath caught in his throat when he saw the figure again, frozen in place near the sedan. But something was different. He looked closer, his eyes narrowing. The man's shadow, the one that had been cast so perfectly before, was wrong. The shape of it was distorted. It clung to the concrete like ink spilled into water, dark and twisting. He rewound the footage and zoomed in on the shadow, the hairs on his arms standing straight up. The shadow didn't follow the man's movements. No matter how much Marcus tried to focus, the figure's shadow remained perfectly still, unmoving. It was as though the shadow was locked in place, refusing to change even as the man's form shifted subtly, his body tilting ever so slightly, the faintest movement of his shoulders. The sick realization slowly unfurled in Marcus's chest. It wasn't a man. Not truly. A man wouldn't cast a shadow like that. Marcus hit rewind again, his pulse quickening. His mind raced, piecing together something that didn't make sense. He should have never gotten involved. His gut had warned him when he first saw the figure, but he had ignored it. Now the cold, suffocating air, the shadow that refused to move, all pointed to something far darker. And then it hit him. The figure wasn't standing next to the car. It was standing in the car. The reality of that statement slammed into Marcus like a physical blow. The figure hadn't moved, hadn't gone anywhere. He had simply shifted in the footage, bending the laws of reality, breaking the very fabric of what he understood as possible. The man in the footage wasn't a man, not in any way that he could comprehend. A soft, almost imperceptible sound came from the direction of the parking lot. It was the faintest whisper, a sound that was both distant and near at the same time. Something moving, something scraping. It sounded like the shuffle of shoes against concrete, slow and deliberate. Marcus froze, his body rigid as his eyes flicked toward the dark hallway outside. The whisper seemed to call to him, just beyond the edge of his hearing. He turned slowly, his flashlight trembling in his grasp. "Hello?" His voice broke the silence, weak and unsure. No answer. He swallowed, his throat dry. His mind raced through scenarios, trying to come up with an explanation for the sound, but nothing fit. It didn't belong. It couldn't be real. But when he turned back toward the monitor, it was clear. The shadow on the screen was moving. It was sliding slowly toward him. The monitor's static crackled, the image jumping in short, violent bursts. But in every flicker, the shadow grew closer, inch by inch, like something was reaching through the television, stretching through the ether, creeping closer and closer until the edges of the screen couldn't contain it anymore. Marcus's breath caught in his throat. The shadow wasn't just in the parking lot. It was in the room with him. It was inside the monitor, pressing up against the screen. The coldness seeped in deeper, his breath frosting over with every exhale. Another scraping sound echoed from the hallway. Marcus spun toward the door, his mind screaming. He backed away from the desk, his heart pounding in his chest. There was no escaping it now. The presence, the thing that had been lurking in the parking lot, was closing in on him. It had been waiting all along. It had always been here in the dark corners of the lot, in the shadows of the empty hallways, feeding on the cold. And now it was coming for him. He moved toward the door, his hands shaking as he reached for the handle. But just before he could grab it, the lights above him flickered once more. Only this time they didn't come back on. The room plunged into darkness. The darkness was immediate, unyielding, cold. Marcus's heart hammered in his chest, the sudden absence of light suffocating him in a way he couldn't fully explain. The hum of the fluorescent lights had ceased altogether, and with it the usual comfort of the steady, predictable noise. Now all that was left was an oppressive silence, one so deep that even his own breath seemed too loud. His pulse rang in his ears like a warning bell. He reached out blindly for the door handle, his fingers trembling as they brushed the cool metal. The absence of light made everything feel distorted. His sense of space was warped, as if the walls were closing in around him, pressing the very air from his lungs. His mind screamed at him to move, to escape, but his body felt as if it had become frozen in place. The scraping sound, so faint, so insidious, came again, but now it was much closer, a slow shuffle like something dragging its feet across the floor. The sound scraped against the edges of his nerves, gnawing at his composure. "Hello?" His voice came out weak, more of a question than a demand. His own voice felt strange in the dark, foreign and fragile. as if the very sound of it could shatter the fragile barrier between him and whatever lay in the depths of the parking lot. No answer. The room felt colder, impossibly so, the air thick with a weight that was no longer just the chill of an old parking lot, but something far worse. Marcus could feel it now, a presence in the space with him, something breathing in the dark. It was there, just beyond his reach, just out of sight, pressing in closer with every breath he took. He could almost feel the air shift around him, something tugging at the fabric of the darkness, pulling at him like an unseen hand. He fumbled for the flashlight in his pocket, his fingers brushing the cool metal before he pulled it free, his breath quickening in his chest. With shaking hands, he clicked the button, but nothing happened. The flashlight's beam stayed dead, lifeless. A cold laugh, low, hollow, echoed faintly in the dark. It was so soft, so distant, that Marcus thought it might have been his imagination, a trick of his mind. But then it came again, closer this time. It wasn't his mind playing tricks. It was real. The sound came from behind him. Frozen with fear, Marcus turned toward the source, his eyes straining to see something in the thick blackness. There was nothing. No figure, no movement. Just the cold, stifling emptiness that seemed to stretch on forever. But then, slowly, he began to feel it. The air was thickening. He could taste it. A sharp, metallic tang clinging to the back of his throat. The shadows in the room seemed to twist, to shift, as though they were alive, curling and breathing, creeping toward him like something waiting to strike. Scrape. The sound was right behind him now, unmistakable. The unmistakable shuffle of something, someone, slowly moving closer. He could hear the scrape of fabric against the floor, the shuffle of feet dragging through the concrete. But the sound was wrong. It wasn't the shuffle of a person. It was something else, something far older, something that didn't belong. Marcus's breath caught in his throat as the temperature seemed to drop even further. His skin tingled, as if the very air had turned to ice. He could see his breath now, the thin, frosty tendrils swirling around him, dancing in the air. He looked up toward the ceiling, as if searching for some kind of answer, but all he saw were the faint, flickering remnants of light, pale, sickly, flickering with a slow, rhythmic pulse that matched the beating of his heart. Scrape, shuffle, closer. The sound of movement grew louder, faster, and suddenly Marcus felt something cold brush against his shoulder. His blood turned to ice as he spun around. There was nothing. No one. Nothing but the dark. But it wasn't nothing. He could feel it, the coldness, the weight of it, pressing in on him. He could feel something watching him from within the dark, a presence that was both formless and all-consuming, like a predator just waiting for the right moment to strike. He stumbled back, his body slamming into the desk with a thud. He reached out, his hands desperately seeking the wall for support, but there was nothing there. Only the shadows, closing in on him, suffocating him with their unnatural presence. He couldn't breathe, he couldn't think. It felt as though the very walls of the room were pressing in on him, closing the space down, trapping him. And then, just as he thought he might lose himself in the dark, the lights flickered again. But this time, they didn't just flicker. They exploded into brightness. A sharp, blinding light that seared into his vision, forcing him to squint. For a moment, everything was too bright, too harsh, and then, just as suddenly, it died away, leaving nothing but a distant, oppressive glow. And then he saw it, standing in the doorway to the parking lot, bathed in the harsh light of the flickering bulb, was the figure, the man, or whatever it was. But this time, it was different. The figure was no longer just a shape in the shadows. It had taken form, its features becoming sharper, more defined, like a nightmare brought to life. His eyes were black, voids deep and endless. His face was obscured, twisted, as though it had been melted away, leaving only a distorted mockery of a human face. His hands were thin, too long, fingers elongated and stretching unnaturally toward Marcus, as though they were hungry. And behind him, in the faint light, Marcus saw something far worse, the shadow. It was no longer just a dark shape on the ground. It was moving. It was stretching, growing, as if it were feeding off the figure's presence, the light, the air. It was alive. The shadow reached out, a dark, insidious thing that seemed to wrap around the room, crawling across the walls, curling around the desk, enveloping everything in its path. Marcus felt it tug at his skin, pulling at him, like 1,000 tiny, icy fingers gripping him. His heart pounded in his chest, his breath shallow. He wanted to scream, to run, but the words stuck in his throat, choked by the terror crawling through his veins. The thing was advancing. It wasn't moving like a person, not in any way that made sense. It was drifting, floating, like a shadow itself. Its feet never touched the floor. The scraping sound came again, louder now, a slow, rhythmic scratching that made Marcus's skin crawl. He couldn't escape it. The shadow, the thing that had been waiting here in the darkness, was closing in on him. And then the voice came, low, a rasp that scraped along his bones. "You shouldn't have come back." Marcus gasped for air, his legs giving way beneath him as he collapsed to the floor, his body racked with cold. His eyes flicked back to the figure in the doorway, but it wasn't there anymore. The parking lot was silent again, but the shadow remained. It was everywhere, waiting. The parking lot was silent again, but Marcus felt like he was suffocating in the quiet. The coldness clung to him like a shroud, its icy tendrils wrapping around his throat, making each breath more difficult than the last. He staggered to his feet, his mind swirling in a chaotic fog. His pulse thundered in his ears as the shadow seemed to stretch out across the floor, flickering beneath the dim light like a living thing, pulsing with an insidious energy. Marcus's eyes darted to the corner of the room, the desk, the monitors. They seemed like distant things, disconnected from his reality, as if he had stepped out of the world he knew and into something darker, more dangerous. The walls of the small security office, once so familiar, now felt like they were closing in around him, crushing him with an overwhelming sense of isolation. He needed to get out. He needed to escape. But something was pulling him back. His gaze shifted to the doorway, to the parking lot outside, where he had seen the figure only moments before. The dark parking lot had once been an unremarkable part of his routine, a place he passed through without thought, like an unspoken agreement between him and the night. But now it felt alive with an unrelenting, oppressive force that seemed to call to him, beckoning him into its depths. The darkness outside seemed to pulse, alive with the same energy that had filled the room just moments ago. A whisper snaked through the room, barely perceptible but undeniable. It slithered across his skin, sending a chill down his spine. "Come back," it seemed to say. "Come find me." The words echoed in his mind, reverberating like a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. His hand trembled as it reached out for the door handle. The cold metal burned his skin as if the very touch of it was cursed. For a moment, he hesitated. His instincts screamed at him to turn around to flee, but some unseen force tethered him to the door. It wasn't just curiosity that had brought him this far. It wasn't just his sense of duty as a security guard. No, something far more insidious had taken root in his mind. He couldn't stop thinking about the figure, the man, or whatever it was, his shadow, that god-forsaken twisted shape that hadn't obeyed the laws of nature. It wasn't just a man. It was something else, something far worse. His breath hitched as he thought about it. the figure in the parking lot standing perfectly still in the shadows. His movements, or lack thereof, reminded him of something buried in his memory, something he hadn't thought about in years. The echo of a name, Lena. The name tore through his thoughts like a shard of glass. His sister. It had been years since he'd thought about her. Years since she had left. A flash of memory burst into his mind, unbidden. The day she disappeared. The cold, overcast sky. The distant sound of rain tapping against the windows as he stood in the living room, watching her walk out the door for the last time. She had always been impulsive, always seeking something, someone beyond the confines of their small world. She had disappeared without a word, without a trace. No one had ever found her. The police had searched the area. They had asked him questions, but he had only shaken his head, unable to provide answers. He hadn't known where she had gone, or why she had left. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Marcus had never felt a shred of guilt about it. Not until now. He had always convinced himself that she had left willingly, that she had made a choice. She had always been a little different after all, always chasing strange things, always searching for the unknown. Marcus had told himself that she had just moved on. She was fine, she had to be, but deep down, he had known. Deep down, he had always known that something had happened to her, something she hadn't been prepared for. And now, as he stood in the cold, dark parking lot, something whispered to him. Lena had never left. She had been taken. The words froze him in place. His breath caught in his throat. He stumbled backward, his legs giving way beneath him, his mind reeling with the horrifying realization. The thing in the parking lot, the figure with the shadow, it wasn't just some random stranger. It wasn't just a shadow on a camera. It was a predator, a hunter, and it had been hunting them both. Marcus's mind spun in a haze as the weight of the past collided with the present. He could almost hear Lena's voice again, distant but clear, just beyond the veil of time. Don't go in the dark, Marcus. It'll follow you. It'll wait for you. The memory was like a fist to the gut, knocking the air from his lungs. He had never fully understood what she had meant. But now, standing at the edge of the parking lot, staring into the deep shadows that stretched before him like a hungry maw, he realized the truth. The shadow wasn't just a part of the figure. The shadow was the figure, and it had been watching him all this time. Lena, Marcus whispered, his voice barely a breath in the cold air. A low, mocking laugh echoed around him, sending a chill down his spine. It was the same hollow sound he had heard earlier, but now it was different. It was closer. It was louder. It felt as though it was inside his head, curling through his thoughts, feeding on his fear. The dark shape at the far end of the lot began to move again, but not in a way that made sense. It didn't walk. It floated, sliding along the ground, its edges blurring and stretching, warping in a way that defied all logic. The shadow began to expand, spreading across the parking lot like a stain, seeping into the walls, reaching out, grasping for him. It's here, the voice in his head whispered. It's always been here. Marcus turned and fled. He couldn't think. His mind was a swirl of frantic thoughts, a cacophony of panic and regret. The cold air tore at his skin, biting through his clothes as he raced back toward the stairwell. His legs burned, his chest heaved with each desperate breath, but he couldn't stop. He couldn't slow down. He had to get away. He didn't stop running until he reached the edge of the parking lot, the stairs leading up to the mall's main entrance just ahead of him. He reached for the door, his hand shaking violently, but as his fingers brushed the cool handle, the faintest whisper of a voice stopped him. You're already too late. His blood ran cold. Before he could react, the ground beneath him shifted. The shadow surged forward, enveloping him, its cold tendrils lashing out, wrapping around his body, pulling him back toward the darkness. He struggled against it, his hands clawing at the concrete, but the shadow was too strong. It dragged him backwards, pulling him into its depths, and then, with a final sickening pull, the darkness swallowed him whole. The world tilted. Marcus's body was weightless as the shadows wrapped themselves around him, tugging him relentlessly deeper into their cold, inescapable grip. His mind screamed, but his voice was lost in the thick, suffocating air. The darkness twisted and stretched, folding in on itself like an endless void. He clawed at the cold concrete, his fingers scraping uselessly against the smooth surface, but the pull was too strong. The shadows tugged harder, forcing him backward into their depths. He tried to scream, but his throat was tight, suffocated by an invisible force. The coldness seeped into his bones, draining all warmth from his body. His vision blurred as the blackness closed in, taking shape, no longer just a void, but a mass, an entity that loomed over him like an immense, suffocating presence. It was here. The voice came again, but this time it wasn't just a whisper. It was everywhere. In his mind, in his ears, in his skin. "You're already mine, Marcus." The words were like an ice-cold blade cutting through his thoughts, a deep, guttural whisper that reverberated through every part of him. He could feel its weight, its suffocating pressure pushing in from all sides. It was everywhere. The air, the space, his very being. There was no escape, no breath, no way out. The shadows warped, twisting into shapes, into faces. Faces that he recognized but couldn't place, shifting like smoke, their features constantly changing, distorting into something unnatural. It was as though the shadows were feeding on his fear, pulling from his memories, twisting them into grotesque parodies. Faces of people he once knew, people who had never been in the parking lot, never been part of his life. Yet, here they were, staring at him with empty eyes, their mouths frozen in silent screams. He tried to move, but his body felt heavy, like 100 pounds of stone were pushing him into the ground. His legs refused to cooperate, his limbs unresponsive to his commands. The darkness gripped him tighter, pulling him deeper still. And then, the cold presence wrapped around his chest. It felt like hands, thin, brittle fingers squeezing the air from his lungs, tightening around his ribs. He gasped, desperate for breath, but it was as if the air itself had turned to stone. His body lurched against the pull, but the hands around him grew tighter, colder. He was suffocating. The laughter returned, distant but echoing, filling the space like an endless tunnel. "Do you feel it now, Marcus?" The voice cooed, low and mocking. "Do you feel what it's like to be consumed?" The shadows around him seemed to grow, to stretch and twist, pulling him further into the dark. He could feel the ground shifting beneath him, no longer concrete, no longer solid. It was soft, like thick, wet mud that swallowed his feet as he struggled. Each movement he made sent a ripple through the darkness, and the shadows seemed to breathe, rising and falling like the tide. They were alive. The dark was alive. He remembered his sister, her warning, the way she had spoken of the dark, how it had always followed her, waiting, the way it had claimed her. He thought about her final moments, the day she had vanished. She had been close, so close, too close. But now, Marcus realized, he wasn't just close to it. He was already in it. He had crossed a threshold, and now there was no turning back. The darkness was part of him, as much a part of the world around. Him as the ground he stood on, the air he breathed. He could feel it now, in the pit of his stomach, creeping into his very soul. His heart thundered in his chest. He could feel it. He could feel it looking at him. The thing, the entity, the shadow. It wasn't just an intangible presence anymore, it was something more. Something that could see him, something that knew him, something that had been waiting for him. "You're not alone, Marcus." The voice again, but this time it was different. It was close, so close. It was inside him, a reflection of his own thoughts, a mirror of his fears. He could feel it, like a shadow within him, pushing against his mind, scraping against his consciousness. "Lena," the voice whispered. The name ripped through his thoughts like a jagged knife. He could feel the weight of it pressing into his skull, bleeding into his memories. Lena, his sister, the one who had disappeared, the one who had left him behind. Marcus's mind reeled. Lena hadn't just vanished. She had fought. He knew it now. She had tried to escape. But the shadows had taken her. They had always been there, always watching, always waiting for the right moment to claim her. He remembered, now with painful clarity, the way her eyes had looked before she left. The fear in them, the quiet warnings she had given him, warnings that had once seemed so distant, so strange. She had known what the dark was. She had known what it could do. But he hadn't listened. He hadn't believed. And now it was too late. The shadows grew heavier, thicker, pressing against him. His lungs burned as if the very air had turned to acid. He tried to scream, to cry out for help, but no sound escaped his mouth. His throat was raw, constricted. His entire body was wrapped in an iron grip, each breath an effort. The presence within the dark was suffocating him, choking him, drawing the life out of him. Suddenly, there was a flicker, a flash of light. For a moment, just a moment, the darkness receded, the shadows pulling away like smoke. The world around him shifted, and he could see, really see, through the dark. He was no longer in the parking lot. He was in somewhere else. The place was familiar. The old, faded house, the one he had grown up in, the one where he and Lena had spent their childhood. The walls were cracked, the floorboards rotted with age, the air thick with dust and neglect. But the house had changed. It was empty now, silent, abandoned. Yet something lingered here, something dark. The same dark that had haunted him, the same shadows that had followed Lena. And there, standing in the doorway of the house, was the figure. Not just a shadow now. It was here, standing before him, fully formed, its dark eyes boring into him like a deep, hollow pit. The figure wore the same coat, the same hollow face, the same distortion that made it feel so unnatural. It was waiting. "You should have known better, Marcus," the voice whispered, as the figure reached out with long, skeletal hands. "The dark has always been with you. Always." The hands reached for him, their fingers brushing against his skin, cold and sharp. But before they could grab him, Marcus felt a sharp, agonizing pull, as though his soul was being ripped from his body. The light flickered again, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then the world collapsed into darkness once more. The world snapped back into place. The air was thick, unnaturally thick, as if every breath came through layers of cold, wet cloth. Marcus's body shuddered violently, as though it were on the brink of being torn apart, yet somehow still tethered to the world he knew. His limbs felt stiff, uncooperative. He couldn't move, couldn't speak. It was as if the shadows themselves had seeped into his very flesh, binding him to this place. The air hummed with an electric pulse, a sinister rhythm that pressed against his mind, vibrating in his skull. The house was gone. It had dissolved into the blackness once more, leaving him standing in a void, a place where time no longer had any meaning, where the laws of reality had ceased to exist. There were no walls here, no boundaries. It was as if he were floating in the middle of some infinite abyss. surrounded only by the creeping tendrils of darkness that clung to his skin like an insidious, suffocating fog. The figure appeared again. It materialized out of the blackness, rising from the shadows like smoke given form, its presence a distortion of the air itself. It was closer now, too close. The hollow face that stared at him was no longer featureless. It was twisted, a grotesque parody of a human face, as if the very act of creating it had warped the essence of what it once was. Its eyes were black holes, voids of infinite depth, nothingness. The mere sight of them made his stomach churn, the feeling of being swallowed whole creeping over him like a slow poison. It opened its mouth. A low, guttural sound poured from it, like the wind scraping against dry, cracked earth. But the voice that followed was something far worse. It wasn't just a sound. It was a feeling, a pulse that reverberated through his very soul. "You've always been mine, Marcus." The words echoed in his chest, rattling his ribs, shaking his body with a force that was almost physical. He could feel them sinking into his bones, sinking deep, where nothing could reach them. He gasped, his throat constricting in response to the pressure building inside him. His knees buckled, and he fell to the ground, the cold of the void seeping into his bones. The figure's shadow stretched out before him, far longer than any shadow should be, dark tendrils reaching out, slithering over the ground like serpents. Hungry and twisted, it didn't move like a human. It glided, an unnatural fluidity that defied all the natural laws of space and time. It was everywhere, filling the void with its oppressive weight. Marcus tried to scream, but his voice was trapped, buried beneath the overwhelming pressure of the shadow's presence. His throat burned, the air thick with the taste of iron and ash. His mind spun in circles, grasping for some kind of sense, some kind of escape. But all he could see, feel, was the entity looming before him, towering over him like a dark god, a predator closing in on its prey. "You knew I was here all along," the figure whispered, its voice a cold caress that wrapped around his thoughts. "You've always known, Marcus. You just refused to listen. You ignored the signs. The darkness has been following you, waiting for you always." The shadow shifted, swirling around Marcus like a storm, each movement deliberate, each step a reminder that this was no accident. The thing, the shadow, was not just an entity. It was part of something older, something that had been watching him long before he had ever stepped into this cursed mall. It was tied to his past, to his sister's disappearance, to Lena's warning. The cold laughter rippled through the air, surrounding him like 1,000 whispers. The laughter grew louder, filling every corner of the void. It was the laughter of something that had already won, something that had already devoured every scrap of hope and replaced it with despair. Lena was never meant to leave. You were never meant to escape. All of this whole life, was part of the plan. She never truly left, Marcus. She's here, with me. She's been here all along. The words cut through Marcus like a jagged blade, the agony of realization stabbing him deep in his heart. Lena had been taken. He had known it all along, buried in his subconscious, but he had refused to believe it. He had convinced himself that she had just run away, that she had chosen to leave. But the truth was far worse than that. The darkness had claimed her, just as it was now claiming him. The figure loomed closer, its presence pressing down on him, the air thick with its suffocating force. Marcus could feel the shadows wrapping around his legs, pulling him deeper into the void. His skin crawled as they tightened, the cold tendrils digging into his flesh. His body was numb, but his mind was wide awake, screaming at him to escape, to fight. But there was nothing he could do. The shadows had him. The darkness had already won. It was inevitable. The past is already written, Marcus. You can't undo it. You can't escape it. You were always meant to return to me. The figure's face seemed to twist, its features contorting into something more horrific, more grotesque. The eyes grew larger, darker, pulling him in, trapping him in their abyss. He could feel himself falling into them, his mind slipping further and further, his thoughts unraveling, consumed by the darkness. But even in the face of this overwhelming terror, a small part of Marcus fought back. A memory flickered, a fleeting image of Lena, her laughter, her voice, the warmth of her presence. It felt like a dream, but it was enough to push him, to give him the strength to struggle against the inevitable. No. The word barely escaped his lips, a whisper lost in the dark, but it was enough. The moment the word left his mouth, the darkness recoiled, pulling back just a fraction. It was as if the very air had cracked, the hold loosening just slightly. The shadow hesitated. Marcus's mind raced. He could feel something inside him shifting, a spark of defiance, a spark of life. He couldn't explain it, but he knew. He couldn't just let this be the end. He had to fight. For himself. For Lena. With every ounce of strength he could muster, he pushed against the pull of the shadow. His body trembled, every part of him screaming in protest, but he refused to surrender. He had to escape. He had to fight back. But the shadows were relentless. The figure's laughter grew louder, more vicious, as it reached for him. It stretched forward, the black tendrils coiling tighter, the cold fingers of death wrapping around him. It wanted to drag him back into the abyss, to claim him just as it had claimed Lena. The darkness surged one last time, its grip on him growing unbearably tight. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. The shadows were everywhere, pulling him into their depths. There was no escape, only the black, and then the light, a blinding flash. The figure screamed, its form flickering, distorting. The shadows writhing around Marcus began to dissolve, retreating like a flood receding back into the earth. The darkness screamed as it vanished, and Marcus, with his heart pounding in his chest, felt himself falling back to the ground, to the light, to the world that had once been his. Marcus gasped as the world shifted, the suffocating grip of the shadow loosening in an instant. His lungs filled with air, each breath sharp and painful, but at the same time, it was a relief, a sign that he wasn't completely lost, not yet. His body was heavy, like he had been pulled from the deepest part of a nightmare, and his mind still raced, trying to piece together what had just happened. But as the world around him began to clear, he realized something. Something was wrong. The air was still cold, but not the same kind of cold. It was a biting, lingering chill that clung to his skin, crawling under his clothes. It wasn't the deep, suffocating cold of the void he had just escaped, but it was just as unnatural, just as unsettling. The familiar surroundings of the underground parking lot slowly came into focus. The flickering lights, the faint smell of oil and metal, the echo of his breathing, it all seemed so ordinary, so real. But it wasn't. It couldn't be. Marcus's legs trembled beneath him as he stood, bracing himself against the nearest wall. His vision swam for a moment, the edges of the parking lot blurring like a distant memory, as if he wasn't quite sure he was still there. His fingers twitched, his senses screaming at him that something wasn't right. The lights above him buzzed, the cold hum vibrating in his skull. But the rest of the lot was eerily silent. There were no cars, no stragglers, no sounds of movement. Everything was still. And yet, the weight of the shadow remained. He looked around, his eyes scanning the familiar rows of parked vehicles, and for a brief moment, he thought he saw it. Him. The figure he had fought so hard to escape. For a second, just a glimpse, Marcus swore he saw it standing by one of the cars, shrouded in darkness, its eyes gleaming in the dim light. But when he blinked, it was gone. Gone like a fading dream. Was he still here? The question gnawed at him, clawing at the edges of his mind. The entity had been so close, so powerful. He had fought it. He had felt its grip weaken, its form unravel. But now, as he stood there in the empty parking lot, he wasn't sure if the victory had been real. The shadows had retreated. Yes. But did that mean they were gone for good? He shuddered involuntarily. The memory of those hollow eyes, the twisting, distorted face. He couldn't shake it. It was as if the darkness had left its mark on him, branding him from the inside out. He couldn't escape it. It was always with him. He stumbled toward the stairwell that led to the mall's exit, his mind clouded with confusion. His fingers gripped the cold metal railing, his heart still racing. But something made him pause. The oppressive silence around him felt heavier now, as if the very walls of the parking lot were pressing in on him. There was a sound, distant but unmistakable, a whisper. "You're not free," the voice. It wasn't just in his head. It was real. It was out there, here, in the parking lot with him. His breath caught in his throat, his body frozen in place. The voice was so soft, so quiet, but its meaning hit him like a punch to the gut. He had escaped the shadow. He had fought it back into the depths. But it wasn't gone. It wasn't finished. It had merely bided its time, waiting for the right moment to strike again. The flickering lights above him buzzed louder now, and the coldness grew colder. The shadows in the corners of the parking lot seemed to twist and warp, stretching out toward him as if they had a life of their own. His chest tightened with the realization. The dark wasn't just outside him, it was inside him too. It had infected his very being, his mind, his soul. The shadow had taken root. He didn't want to admit it, but the truth was undeniable. He had been marked, changed. Suddenly he felt it, a sharp sting at the back of his neck, like a cold needle digging into his skin. He reached up instinctively, his fingers brushing against something, wet. He pulled his hand back, confused, and looked at his fingers. Blood. His own blood. His heart skipped a beat. He swore he hadn't felt the pain, hadn't noticed it. But now it was there. He could feel it trickling down his skin, staining his hand. But it wasn't just any blood. There was something wrong about it. Something wrong with him. The blood was dark, like the color had bled out of it. It was the same hue as the shadows that had enveloped him. The darkness was inside him. He staggered backward, the world spinning around him. He could feel the walls of the parking lot pressing in again, the oppressive weight of it all bearing down on him. The laughter, the same hollow, mocking laughter, echoed around him. It wasn't just an echo, it was a vibration. It was coming from the walls, from the ground, from the very space around him. The darkness had always been here. It had always been inside him. Suddenly, the ground beneath his feet shifted, as if the earth itself was moving. The lights flickered, one last time, and then went out completely. Marcus froze. Everything went pitch black. For a long moment he stood there, unable to move, unable to see. His mind raced, his thoughts spinning in a whirlpool of terror, confusion, and disbelief. He tried to call out, but his voice was swallowed by the silence, his words lost to the dark. His throat was tight, as though the very air had turned to stone. Then the whispers returned. But this time they were closer. "You've always been mine, Marcus. Always." The shadows were back. They were inside him. There was no escaping them. The air around him seemed to pulse with a dark, malignant energy. The figure, the entity, was here. It was no longer something distant, something haunting. It was a part of him now, feeding on his fear, on his soul. It had always been a part of him, waiting for him to realize the truth. It had followed him. It had always been following him, and now it was time to collect. In the dark, Marcus could feel the presence drawing nearer, its cold, endless gaze fixed upon him. He could almost hear its breathing, slow and steady, as if it was savoring every moment of his fear, every beat of his frantic heart. His skin crawled, his body trembled. He tried to take a step back, but his legs wouldn't obey. He was frozen, trapped. The darkness had him, and there was no way out. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. The figure moved closer, its hollow eyes boring into his soul. "You belong to me now." The last thing Marcus saw before the darkness swallowed him whole were those eyes, those infinite hollow eyes, staring into his, and the cold, merciless grip of the shadows that consumed him. And then the silence returned. The void was absolute. There was no sound, no light, no warmth, just a suffocating, endless nothingness. Marcus's body felt heavy, suspended in the emptiness. His mind, too, seemed suspended, caught in a strange, unreal limbo. His consciousness flickered, like a dying flame caught in the wind, struggling to stay alight. For a moment, Marcus wasn't sure if he was still alive. It had all become a blur, the edges of his memories like shattered glass, slipping away from him faster than he could grasp them. His last moments in the parking lot had been filled with terror, with that overwhelming presence of the entity closing in on him, wrapping around him like a suffocating blanket. But now, here in the dark, everything felt distant. His thoughts were sluggish, disjointed, like pieces of a broken puzzle. He couldn't move. He couldn't feel his body. It was as if he was no longer part of the world, but only a lingering fragment of something that had been left behind. Then, a flicker of awareness. It was waiting. The thought crashed through him, sharp and intrusive. The darkness wasn't just around him. It was inside him. It had seeped into his very core, entwined itself with his soul. He couldn't escape. The shadows had claimed him. It was never just about the parking lot, the figure, the cold whispers. It was about the darkness that had always been inside him, following him, feeding off his fear. He had only been running from it, pushing it away. But it had always been there, lying in wait, biding its time. The dark had always been part of him. He tried to scream, but there was no sound, no voice. His mouth was dry, his throat tight, as if the very act of trying to speak had been stolen from him. But the darkness didn't need his voice. It didn't need his fear. It had already consumed it. Was this it? The thought twisted in, his mind dark and foreboding. Was he trapped here forever? Was this what had become of his sister? Had she too been consumed by the same shadow, swallowed by the same void? He had never understood her warnings, the strange things she had said before she disappeared. But now it all made sense. The darkness had taken her, just as it had taken him. And as the darkness pressed in closer, Marcus could hear something, a faint sound, like a whisper in the dark. But this time, it wasn't just a voice. It was familiar. Lena. Her voice, soft and broken, echoed in his mind. Marcus. His heart skipped. His breath hitched, though he wasn't sure if he was still capable of breathing. Her voice was distant, but it felt so real, so close. He could almost hear the tremor in her words, the fear that had once been so apparent in her eyes. Marcus, listen. He tried to focus, to latch onto the sound of her voice, but the darkness was suffocating him, pressing against him, making it hard to think. He could feel it, like a heavy weight on his chest. Yet through the black, Lena's voice came, again more insistent this time. You have to fight it, Marcus. You have to remember who you are. Her words pulsed through him like a heartbeat, a reminder of a life he had almost forgotten, the fear that had once plagued him, the loneliness, the guilt. It had all been a part of the shadow's design. It was trying to consume him, to swallow him whole, to erase every trace of who he had been, to turn him into something else. But there was a flicker of light within him, a fragile ember that refused to die. Marcus grasped onto that ember with everything he had. Fight it. He wasn't sure how, but somehow he knew that the darkness, the shadow, wasn't just a thing outside of him. It was part of him. His fear, his doubt, his guilt, it had been feeding it, giving it power. It had always been in his mind, waiting for him to surrender. But now he understood. He had to reclaim himself. He had to remember who he was. The presence around him seemed to shift, its suffocating grip loosening just slightly. Marcus forced himself to focus, to concentrate on the feeling of his body, on the warmth that was still there. Faint, distant, but there. His chest still rose and fell, his heart still beat. He was still alive. I'm still alive. The thought was enough to push against the darkness. It didn't own him, not yet. Not completely. But the shadow wasn't done with him, not by a long shot. It recoiled briefly, as if in response to his resistance, but then, with a violent lurch, the darkness surged forward, wrapping around him once more, pulling him back into its depths. The laughter, that sickening, hollow laugh, filled the void. It was louder now, crueler, more confident. The shadow had never been defeated. It was only playing with him. You will never escape me. The voice reverberated through him, drowning him. He felt the very essence of the shadow as it filled the space around him, suffocating him, twisting his thoughts. It wanted him. It wanted to pull him back into the nothingness, to claim him completely, and yet for a split second, the darkness faltered. Marcus's mind flashed with memories, fragments of his life. Lena, his family, his past. All the things he had tried to forget, tried to bury, all the regrets, the guilt, the pain. They were his memories, they were his life, and the shadow, the darkness. It was not him. It was an invader. He screamed. The scream tore through the silence of the void, ripping through the darkness like a knife. The force of it shattered the illusion, fractured the reality the shadow had built around him. He could feel the weight of it break, the cold tendrils loosening, retreating into the corners of his mind. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Marcus felt free. The darkness recoiled, pulling away, retreating like a wounded animal. It whispered, its voice seeping into his thoughts. But now, it felt distant. The grip that had once held him so tightly was weakening. The void began to recede. Then a blinding light pierced through the dark. A flash of warmth, a wave of sensation that felt like life itself rushing back into his bones. His vision blurred with the intensity of it, but then he felt the ground beneath his feet, solid and real. The air was warmer now, the chill dissipating. And as the light intensified, Marcus felt something stir within him, a deep, primal understanding. He was still here. He had won. The darkness was still present, lurking on the edges of his mind, but it no longer had control. It had been pushed back, for now. And as he stood there, his chest heaving, his mind racing with disbelief and relief, he knew one thing for certain. The fight wasn't over. But it was his fight now, and he would never be alone again. The light enveloped him, warm and final. Then everything faded.